Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into the hidden world of Victorian England, where beauty was not just an ideal, but a daily prison. Imagine waking up each morning knowing that simply getting dressed would take nearly an hour, that you couldn't breathe deeply, couldn't bend freely, couldn't even dress yourself without help. This was the reality for millions of women, and the device that controlled their every movement, their every breath. It wasn't a law. It wasn't a rule written in any book. It was something they wore against their skin every single day from sunrise until they finally collapsed into bed at night. Tonight, we're going to uncover the strange, the beautiful, and the deeply troubling devices that shaped Victorian women's lives. And we begin with the most powerful one of all. Now, before we step back in time together, I would love it if you could take just a moment to subscribe to this channel and give this video a like, but only if you truly enjoy what we explore tonight. I want your support to be genuine, not just automatic. And I'm curious, where are you right now? What time is it where you're watching? Are you in bed on your couch? Maybe taking a quiet moment for yourself? Drop a comment and let me know. I love hearing from you. All right, dim those lights, get comfortable, maybe turn on a fan or some gentle background sound. Let's travel back to a morning in 1857 and discover what it really meant to be a woman in the Victorian age. Picture this. It's 6:30 in the morning, London. The gas lamps are still flickering in the pre-dawn darkness. In a modest bedroom in a middle-class home, a young woman named Ella Lenina is already awake, but she's not getting out of bed yet, because she can't. Not alone, anyway. You see, Ella Lenina is still wearing her nightgown. But in a few moments, her lady's maid will knock on the door, carrying something that looks almost medieval. It's made of heavy cotton, reinforced with thin strips of whale, bone, and it laces up the back with cords so tight they could snap if pulled too hard. It's her corset, and without it, Ella Lenina cannot get dressed. Without it, she cannot leave her room. Without it, according to every rule of respectable society, she cannot exist. The maid enters, Ella Lenina stands, her arms raised slightly, and then begins a process that will take at least 30 minutes. First, the chemise, a thin cotton undergarment. Then the corset is wrapped around Ella Lenina's torso. The maid begins to lace, pulling the cords through metal eyelets one by one. Ella Lenina takes a breath, holds it, the maid pulls tighter. Ella Lenina's waist begins to shrink. 24 in 23-22. With each tug, Ella Lenina's ribs compress inward. Her lungs have less space to expand. Her stomach presses against her spine. This is normal. This is respectable. This is what every woman she knows does every single morning. Now, let me pause here and tell you something important. There's a myth about Victorian corsets that we need to clear up right away. You've probably heard the stories. Corsets crushed women's organs. They broke ribs. They made it impossible to move. Women were fainting left and right, basically suffocating themselves for beauty. And while some of that is true, the full picture is far more complicated and in many ways more disturbing, because the real power of the corset wasn't just physical. It was social. It was psychological. It was about control. Let's go back in history for a moment. Corsets didn't start in the Victorian era. Women had been wearing structured undergarments since the 1500s. But it was in the Victorian period, roughly 1837 to 1901, that the corset reached its peak of influence. In 1848, a man named Joseph Cooper invented a new design with a front-fastening busk. This was supposed to be revolutionary, see, because now a woman could remove her corset without having someone unlace the back. The problem: society still expected corsets to be worn at almost all times. So, this improvement didn't really free anyone. It just made the prison slightly more convenient. Here's where it gets really interesting. In 2020, a team of medical anthropologists studied the skeletal remains of women who lived in the 18th and 19th centuries. They wanted to see once and for all what corsets actually did to the female body. And what they found was surprising. Yes, there were changes to the rib cages. The lower ribs showed signs of compression, a subtle inward curve that wouldn't naturally be there. But here's the thing. These changes were relatively minor. They didn't cause severe pain or injury in most cases. And these women lived long lives. Their deaths had nothing to do with their clothing. So what does that mean? Does it mean corsets were harmless? Absolutely not. Because the damage wasn't always physical. It was about what the corset represented. It was about what it took away. Think about Ella Lanina again, standing in her bedroom, laced into her corset. Her waist is now 22 and around. For context, the average woman's natural waist today is about 27 to 30 in. Ella Lanina can take shallow breaths, but she cannot take a deep one. She cannot bend at the waist to pick something up off the floor. If she drops her handkerchief, she has to squat straight-legged or ask someone else to retrieve it for her. She will wear this corset for the next 16 hours, through breakfast, through morning calls, through needlework and letter writing and receiving guests, through dinner, until finally late at night her maid will return and spend a knot. Her 10 minutes, unlacing her. And only then will Ella Lanina's body remember what it feels like to expand fully, to breathe completely. Now, here's where class comes into this story, and it's important. Not all corsets were created equal. Ella Lanina, as a middle-class woman, wears a moderately tight corset. It's uncomfortable, yes, but she can still move enough to manage her household, to do light tasks. But upper-class women, the wives and daughters of wealthy merchants, of aristocrats, they wore corsets laced even tighter. Why? Because they didn't have to work. A tightly laced corset was proof that you were a lady of leisure. It announced to everyone who saw you that you didn't need to bend, to reach, to labor. You had servants for that. Your body was ornamental, decorative, not functional. And on the other end of the spectrum, working-class women still wore corsets, but theirs were looser, made of cheaper materials, less boned. They had to be because these women worked in factories, in kitchens, inries. They couldn't afford to faint from lack of oxygen while stirring a pot or operating machinery. So even the corset, even this intimate garment, became a marker of social class. You could literally look at a woman's silhouette and know where she belonged in society. There's a letter that has survived from the late 1800s, written by an American singer named Emma Thursby. Emma was born in 1845 and became quite famous in her time, and in this letter she describes ordering something called the doctor's corset from a shop in Paris. She was excited about it, presumably because it was supposed to be more comfortable, more healthy than regular corsets. She wore it for 2 days, and then she wrote these words, wore it 2 days and was nearly killed. It upset all my internal arrangements and made me sick at my stomach. She had to see a doctor who told her she should never wear such a thing again. So she had to order yet another corset, this one costing 80 francs, which was extremely expensive at the time. Think about what that means. Even a corset designed by doctors, marketed as a health improvement, made a strong, healthy woman violently ill. And yet she didn't stop wearing corsets altogether. She just had to find a different one. Because in her world, in her time, going without was simply not an option. Let me tell you about the real dangers of tight lacing, because they were very real, even if they weren't quite as dramatic as the myths suggest. When you compress the torso for hours every day, several things happen. Your lungs cannot fully expand, which means you're breathing shallowly all the time. This can lead to dizziness and fainting, especially in warm weather or crowded rooms. Your digestive system is compressed, leading to chronic indigestion and constipation. Your back muscles, which should be supporting your posture naturally, begin to atrophy because the corset is doing their job for them. Over time, if a girl started wearing corsets young enough and wore them tightly enough for long enough, her muscles could actually become so weak that she felt like she couldn't stand upright without the corset. It became a self-fulfilling prophecy. The device meant to support her actually made her dependent on it. And then there were the reproductive issues. Now, this is where Victorian doctors really got it wrong. They blamed corsets for all sorts of things: miscarriages, infertility, deformed, babies. And while tight corsets certainly didn't help matters, a lot of these problems had other causes that the doctors didn't understand yet. But here's the insidious part. By blaming women's clothing for reproductive issues, doctors were essentially blaming women themselves. It became another way to control female behavior, another way to say, your body is wrong. Your choices are wrong. You need us to tell you how to live. But let's return to Eleanor for a moment, because her story isn't finished. It's now mid-morning. She's been dressed for 3 hours. She's sitting in her drawing room embroidering when she feels a familiar tightness in her chest. She can't quite get enough air. The room feels warm. She stands up thinking maybe a walk to the window will help, but the movement makes her dizzy. Her vision starts to darken at the edges, and then, very gracefully, very quietly, Eleanor faints. Her maid rushes over, loosens the corset laces just a bit, waves smelling salts under Eleanor's nose. Within a minute or two, Eleanor comes to. She's embarrassed, apologetic. "I don't know what came over me," she murmurs, but she does know. Her body was screaming for oxygen and she couldn't give it any. This will happen again. Maybe next week, maybe tomorrow. It's just part of being a woman, she's been told. Women are delicate, fragile, prone to vapors and fainting spells. It's their nature. Except it wasn't their nature. It was their clothing. Here's something that I find particularly heartbreaking. Young girls started wearing corsets at puberty, sometimes even earlier. There are accounts from the early 1800s of mothers laying their daughters down on the carpet, placing a foot on the girl's back, and pulling the corset laces so tight that several laces would snap from the force. Can you imagine being 12 or 13 years old and having your own mother essentially teach you that your natural body is unacceptable, that you must be squeezed and shaped and controlled to be worthy? That discomfort, even pain, is just the price of being respectable. Some girls were even made to sleep in their corsets to train their figures while they were still growing. The physical implications of this were significant, the psychological ones immense. Now, I want to be fair here. Not every Victorian woman hated her corset. Some genuinely felt that it provided back support, that it helped them maintain good posture. In an era when dresses could weigh 15 to 20 lb with all their layers, a corset did help distribute some of that weight. And some women felt elegant, put together, fashionable in their corseted silhouette. We have to remember that these women lived in a specific time and place with specific beauty ideals, and many of them internalized those ideals completely. They couldn't imagine appearing in public without a corset any more than you could imagine leaving your house without pants on. But that's exactly the point, isn't it? That's exactly how effective the control was. It wasn't forced on them by armed guards. It was woven so deeply into the fabric of society, into their sense of self, into their understanding of what it meant to be a proper woman, that many of them enforced it on themselves. They pleased their own bodies. They laced themselves into discomfort every morning and called it normal. As we close this first part of our journey tonight, I want you to think about Eleanor getting ready for bed. Her maid unlaces her corset. The relief is immediate, physical, almost overwhelming. Eleanor can finally take a full breath. She can feel her ribs expand outward. Her lungs fill completely. For a moment she stands there just breathing, feeling her body remember its natural shape. And then she puts on her nightgown, climbs into bed and sleeps, because tomorrow morning it will all begin again. The lacing, the compression, the slow, controlled restriction of her very breath. The corset was just the beginning. We've only just started to uncover the strange devices, the peculiar inventions, and the social mechanisms that controlled every aspect of a Victorian woman's day. And if you think the cause, E.T. was restrictive, wait until you hear what came next. because Eleanina's corset was hidden beneath her dress. But the next device we're going to explore, it was impossible to hide. It was enormous, it was dangerous, and at its peak it was responsible for the deaths of thousands of women. So stay with me, settle in a little deeper, because in just a moment we're going to discover the cage that women wore and the terrible price they paid for fashion. So we've talked about what Victorian women wore against their skin, the corset that shaped their torsos and restricted their breath. But now, let's talk about what they wore over that. And trust me, if you thought the corset was extreme, you're not going to believe what came next. There's a fashion item from the Victorian era that killed over 3,000 women in just a few decades. 3,000. Let that sink in for a moment. This wasn't a weapon. It wasn't a disease. It was something women chose to wear, something that fashion magazines celebrated, something that was considered absolutely essential for any respectable lady. And the tragic irony, when it was first invented, people actually thought it was liberating. They thought it was progress. They thought it was going to make women's lives easier. They called it the crinoline. Now, if you've ever seen a movie set in the 1850s or 60s, you've probably seen these. Those massive bell-shaped skirts that make women look like they're floating, like they're taking up half the room wherever they go. Ever wondered what made those skirts stand out like that? It wasn't magic. It wasn't just layers and layers of fabric, though there was plenty of that too. It was a cage, an actual cage made of steel hoops, strapped around a woman's waist and hips, holding her skirt out in a perfect dome shape. And at the peak of this fashion, some of these cages measured 5 yards in circumference. 5 yards. That's 15. FT around, that's the size of a small room. Let me take you back to 1856. This is when the cage crinoline was invented, and it was genuinely seen as revolutionary. Before this, women had been wearing layer after layer after layer of petticoats to achieve the wide-skirted look that was fashionable. We're talking 6, 7, sometimes 8 petticoats, all made of heavy fabric, often stiffened with horsehair. The weight was incredible. Some women were essentially carrying 15 to 20 lb of fabric around their lower bodies all day long. It was hot, it was exhausting, it was hygienically problematic, especially in the summer. So when someone invented a lightweight steel framework that could hold a skirt out to the same width using just 1 or 2 petticoats instead of 8, women were thrilled. Finally, they could achieve the fashionable silhouette without the oppressive weight. Fashion magazines praised it. Advertisements called it the greatest invention of the age for women, and because sewing machines had just recently become widespread, manufacturers could produce these cage crinolines quickly and cheaply. For the first time, even working class women could afford to look fashionable. The crinoline craze swept through England, through Europe, through America. Everyone was wearing them. Can you imagine walking through the world in one of these things? Let's try to picture it together. You're a young woman named Catherine, and it's 1862. You're getting dressed for the day, and after your maid laces your corset, she brings out your crinoline. It's made of flexible steel hoops connected by vertical tapes, creating a cage that looks almost like a bird cage for humans. You step into it, and your maid fastens it around your waist. Immediately, your skirt flares out around you. You look down, and you can't see your own feet anymore. Your dress extends 3 feet in every direction. You walk downstairs for breakfast. The doorways in your house are narrow, so you have to turn sideways to get through them, carefully angling your cage so it doesn't catch on the doorframe. You sit down at the breakfast table, and here's where it gets tricky. The crinoline wants to spring up. The front hoops try to lift up toward your face, potentially exposing your ankles and undergarments, which would be absolutely mortifying. So you have to learn a specific technique. You press down on the front of your skirt with your hands as you sit, carefully balancing the whole structure so it settles around you without revealing anything improper. After breakfast, you decide to go for a walk outside. It's a breezy day, and this is where things get dangerous. You see, a crinoline cage is light. That was its selling point, remember? But that lightness becomes a liability in the wind. A strong gust can literally lift your entire skirt like a sail, exposing your legs, your undergarments, everything. Victorian women had to develop a specific way of walking in wind, pressing their arms against their skirts, taking small steps, constantly vigilant. Imagine living like that. Imagine never being able to relax to move naturally, because at any moment a breeze might literally upend your entire outfit. And the wind wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was fire. Let me tell you a story that appeared in newspapers across England in February of 1863. A 14-year-old girl named Margaret Davy was working as a kitchen maid in a household in the town of Bidford. One afternoon she was doing a simple task, something she'd probably done 100 times before. She was reaching up to the mantelpiece to get a set of spoons, but her enormous crinoline, as she stretched upwards, swung close to the fireplace. The fabric of her dress brushed against the flames. Now, here's something important to understand about Victorian fabrics. Many of them were highly flammable, muslin, cotton, light wools. They could catch fire in an instant, and once a crinoline-supported dress caught fire, it became a death trap. The cage structure allowed air to flow underneath, which fed the flames. The huge volume of fabric meant there was so much material to burn, and the construction of the dress made it nearly impossible to remove quickly. Margaret's dress ignited. Within seconds, she was engulfed in flames. The other servants in the house heard her screaming and rushed to help. But here's the horrifying thing. The women who tried to save her had to be careful because they were wearing crinolines too. If they got too close, their own dresses might catch fire. They threw water. They tried to smother the flames with blankets, but the fire was too intense. Margaret died from her burns a few days later. She was 14 years old, and she was far from the only one. In England alone, in just a 2-month period in 1863, newspapers reported 19 deaths from burning crinolines. 19 women in just 2 months in just one country. The newspapers started calling them crinoline deaths and keeping a running count. Every week, it seemed, there was another tragic story. A woman lighting candles, a woman cooking dinner, a woman standing too close to a gas lamp. In Philadelphia, 9 ballet dancers died in a single incident at the Continental Theater when one dancer's crinoline brushed past a candle and the flame spread from costume to costume across the stage. Think about what that means. These women knew the danger. The newspapers were full of warnings. Everyone had heard stories about crinoline fires, and yet they kept wearing them. Why? Because fashion demanded it, because society demanded it, because a woman who appeared in public without the proper silhouette would be seen as improper, unfashionable, lower-ass. The social consequences of not wearing a crinoline felt more immediate, more real, than the statistical possibility of death by fire. There were other dangers, too, ones that didn't make the newspapers as often but were just as real. Women wearing crinolines got stuck in doorways. They knocked over furniture, tea sets, decorative vases. They couldn't navigate narrow streets or crowded spaces. There are accounts of women being unable to get into carriages because their crinolines were too wide, having to dismantle the hoops partially just to sit down. Some women got their crinolines caught in machinery and factories, leading to horrific accidents. Others had their crinolines catch on fences or gates while they were walking, literally trapping them in place. And here's a detail that's almost darkly funny if it weren't so sad. Women had to learn how to manage their crinolines in wind so they wouldn't blow up and expose them, right? Well, on particularly windy days, some women would sew small lead weights into the hems of their dresses to keep them down. Lead weights. They were literally weighing themselves down to maintain modesty. The liberating, lightweight crinoline had become so unmanageable that women were voluntarily making their clothing heavier again. Let me tell you about the truly massive crinolines, the ones at the absolute peak of the fashion in the late 1850s and early 1860s. Some of these had diameters of 6 feet. 6 feet. That means from the center of your body to the edge of your skirt was 3 feet. You literally could not stand close to another person. You couldn't walk arm in arm with a friend. You certainly couldn't embrace your husband or your children without your skirt creating this huge barrier between you. Women became isolated inside these cages, physically separated from the people around them. Victorian satists had a field day with this. Punch magazine, the famous humor publication Publi, shed cartoon after cartoon mocking crinolines. One cartoon showed a man and a woman trying to kiss, but the crinoline kept them so far apart they couldn't reach each other. Another showed a woman's crinoline knocking over everyone and everything in a crowded room like a wrecking ball. The cartoons were funny, but they were also revealing something true. This fashion was absurd. It was impractical. It was dangerous, and everyone knew it. But it continued anyway. Now, here's where the story takes an interesting turn. By the mid-1860s, the shape of the fashionable silhouette began to change. Instead of the skirt projecting out equally in all directions, the fullness started moving toward the back. The front of the skirt flattened out, and all that volume shifted to the rear. This meant the cage crinoline had to evolve too. Manufacturers started making what was called a crinolite, basically a half crinoline. It was flat in front but still had hoops in the back. Eventually, this evolved into something called a bustle, which we'll talk about more soon, but basically it was a padded or structured bump worn at the lower back to make the skirt project outward behind you. Why did the fashion change? Partly it was just the natural evolution of style. Fashion is always moving, always changing, but I think part of it was also practical exhaustion. Women had been dealing with these enormous, unwieldy, dangerous crinolines for almost a decade. The novelty had worn off, the death toll was mounting, and while the fashion industry would never admit that crinolines had been a terrible idea, they could quietly shift the silhouette to something slightly less extreme. But here's what fascinates me about this whole crinoline era. It perfectly illustrates something important about Victorian women's lives. The crinoline was marketed as liberation, remember, freedom from heavy petticoats, and in a why limited sense that was true. But that liberation came with a whole new set of restrictions. You might not be carrying 20% of fabric anymore, but now you couldn't fit through doorways. You couldn't sit normally. You couldn't go near fire without risking your life. You were freed from one cage only to be locked in another. And the women of the time understood this. We have letters and diaries from Victorian. Women complaining about their crinolines, joking about them, expressing frustration with them, but they kept wearing them because the alternative, being unfashionable, being improper, being seen as lower-ass or unstylish, that was worse. That's how powerful social control is. It doesn't need laws or police. It just needs everyone to agree that this is how things are done, and the consequences of defying that agreement to feel more real than any physical discomfort or danger. Let me share one more story before we move on, because I think it captures something essential about this whole bizarre period. There's an account from 1860 of a woman, a wealthy woman, attending a garden party. She's wearing her finest dress over her largest crinoline because this is an important social event. She's walking through the garden admiring the flowers, chatting with friends, and she doesn't notice that her crinoline has caught on a rose bush. She keeps walking. The bush starts to bend, then suddenly snaps back, thorns and all, into the back of her dress. She's stuck. She can't move forward. She can't turn around to see what's happened. She can't reach behind herself to untangle the fabric because her corset won't let her bend that way. She's just stuck in the middle of a garden party attached to a rosebush, unable to free herself. Other women notice her predicament and rush over to help, but they're all wearing crinolines too, so they can't get close enough to actually reach the tangled fabric. Finally, someone has to get a male servant to come and literally cut the rosebush away from her dress, which ruins the back of her gown completely. The woman was humiliated. But what's the moral of this story? Did she stop wearing crinolines? No. Did anyone at that party decide this fashion was ridiculous? No. They all just laughed it off as an unfortunate accident and continued wearing the same absurd, dangerous, impractical garments. That's the thing about fashion as control. It's voluntary, it's invisible. It doesn't look like oppression because women are choosing it, participating in it, even defending it. But when the choice is between conformity and social death, between fashion and ostracism, is it really a choice at all? The crinoline eventually faded from fashion by the early 1870s, replaced by new silhouettes, new structures, new ways to shape the female form into something ornamental and impractical. But the question it raises remains relevant. How do we shape our bodies to fit society's demands? What discomfort do we accept as normal? What dangers do we minimize because everyone else is taking the same risks? The Victorian woman in her crinoline might seem like a relic from another world, but the pressures she faced, those haven't gone anywhere. They've just changed shape. Now, the crinoline controlled how much space a woman took up in the world, how she moved through doorways and rooms and crowded spaces. But there was another device that controlled something even more personal, even more daily, even more intimate. Something women did to themselves every single morning, often causing pain, often causing damage, all in the pursuit of the perfect Victorian ideal. So, take a breath. Settle a little deeper into wherever you are right now, because we're about to explore the dangerous world of Victorian beauty rituals and how something as simple as curling your hair could leave you scarred for life. There's something almost sacred about a woman's hair, even today, right? It's personal. It's intimate. It's one of the first things people notice about you. And in the Victorian era, hair wasn't just important. It was everything. A woman's hair was seen as the crowning glory of her femininity, a visible marker of her health, her virtue, her very worth as a person. Long, lustrous, perfectly styled hair could make up for a plain face, but thin, damaged, or poorly maintained hair that was almost unforgivable. So naturally, Victorian women would do anything to achieve the perfect hairstyle, and I mean anything, including holding red-hot metal rods inches from their faces every single morning, breathing in the smell of their own hair burning, and praying they wouldn't accidentally set themselves on fire or scar their foreheads for life. Welcome to the world of Victorian hair, curling, where beauty literally meant playing with fire. Let me take you inside a bedroom on a typical morning in 1875. Meet our friend, a young woman named Harriet. She's already dressed, already corseted, already wearing her multiple layers of undergarments in her day dress. But her hair still hanging loose down her back, unbrushed, unstyled. And this is a problem because Harriet is expected at a morning social call in 2 hours, and she cannot, absolutely cannot, appear with her hair simply hanging there like she's just rolled out of bed. The fashion of the moment demands curls, soft ringlets framing the face, elaborate waves cascading from an upswept style, and Harriet's hair, while long and relatively healthy, is naturally straight as a pin. So she sits down at her dressing table, and her lady's maid brings out the curling tongs. These are not like the curling irons you might use today, the ones that plug into the wall and have temperature settings and automatic shut-offs. No, Victorian curling tongs were two hinged pieces of iron formed into handles at one end and narrow cylindrical blades at the other. They looked almost like scissors, except instead of blades they had these rounded metal rods. And to heat them, you stuck them directly into the fireplace or over a gas flame or into a special alcohol-fueled lamp if you were wealthy enough to afford one. Harriet's maid takes the tongs and holds them over the flame of an oil lamp. She counts in her head, estimating how long they need to heat. 30 seconds, a minute. There's no thermometer, no indicator, light, no way to know if they're the right temperature except experience and guesswork. The metal begins to glow slightly. The maid pulls them away from the flame and quickly tests them by holding them near her own wrist, feeling the radiant heat. Too hot and they'll scorch Harriet's hair right off. Too cool and they won't hold a curl at all. She decides they're ready. She takes a section of Harriet's hair, carefully wraps it in a piece of paper called a curl paper. This is supposed to protect the hair from direct contact with the hot metal, and then winds the protected strand around the tongs. She holds them there, counting slowly, 10 seconds, 15, 20. The smell of hot paper fills the room, and underneath it just barely the acrid smell of singing hair. Even with the paper protection, some damage is inevitable. The maid unwraps the tongs, and there it is, a perfect ringlet, one down, about 20 more to go. This process, getting all of Harriet's hair curled and styled, will take the better part of an hour, and every single curl carries the risk of burns to the hair itself, leaving it brittle and broken. Burns to the scalp if the tongs slip, burns to the forehead, the neck, the ears if the maid isn't careful, and Harriet has to sit very, very still because any sudden movement could be disastrous. Now, you might be wondering, is this a new invention? Did the Victorians come up with this dangerous beauty ritual? Actually, no. People have been curling their hair with heat for thousands of years. In ancient Egypt, they found curling tongs in tombs. In ancient Greece, women wrapped damp hair around smooth sticks to create corkscrews. The Romans used hollow metal rods called calamistrum, heated them in fire, and rolled their hair around them. So, in a way, Harriet sitting at her dressing table with hot metal near her face is participating in a ritual that goes back millennia. Humans have always been willing to risk pain for beauty, but the Victorian era took it to a new level of both sophistication and danger. In 1872, a Frenchman named Marcel Gratau revolutionized hairstyling when he invented what became known as the Marcel wave. This was a specific technique using specially designed curling tongs to create deep uniform waves rather than tight ringlets. Grat's tongs were an improvement over earlier designs. They had a rounder, smoother surface that distributed heat more evenly, but they still had to be heated over an open flame, and they still burned countless women's hair and scalps. The real innovation came a bit later with the invention of the alcohol-fueled curling lamp. This was a small, decorative lamp that sat on a lady's dressing table, fueled by alcohol, creating a steady flame specifically for heating curling tongs. If you were wealthy, you could buy an entire curling set, decorative metal stand, alcohol, lamp, and plated curling iron, all beautifully engraved for about $2.90 in 1897. Now, that might not sound like much, but, adjusted for inflation, that's over $82 in modern money. Just for the privilege of burning your hair at home in a slightly more elegant fashion, let me tell you a story that I think perfectly captures the cultural pressure around hairstyling in this era. There was a young woman named Laura Ingalls. You might know her as Laura Ingalls Wilder, the author of the Little House on the Prairie books. In her later books, the ones covering her teenage years in the 1880s, Laura describes desperately wanting to cut bangs and curl them in the fashionable style of the day. Her mother was completely against it. She argued that Laura should keep her hair long and natural, that cutting it was vain and frivolous, that long hair never goes out of style. But Laura was young. She wanted to look fashionable like the other girls in town. She wanted to feel pretty, modern, stylish. So eventually, she defied her mother. She cut bangs, and then every morning she had to curl them. She would heat metal rods on the family's wood stove, the same stove they used for cooking, and carefully apply them to her forehead hair. Can you imagine a teenage girl in a frontier farmhouse heating metal rods on a stove that's probably covered in cooking grease and soot, and then putting them near her face? The potential for disaster was enormous, and disasters happened all the time. Victorian newspapers and diaries are full of accounts of women burning themselves with curling tongs, scorched foreheads, burned fingertips, entire sections of hair fried off at the root. Some women developed permanent bald patches from repeated burns to the same area of scalp. Others had visible scars on their temples or hairline where the hot metal had touched skin. But here's what's truly remarkable. Despite all of this, despite the pain and the damage and the risk, women kept doing it every single day, because the alternative, appearing with unfashionable straight hair or an unstyled head, was socially unacceptable. Hair that wasn't properly dressed was seen as a sign of laziness, of moral laxity, even of questionable virtue. A woman's hair was supposed to reflect the care and attention she put into her appearance, which in turn reflected her character. And it wasn't just about curling. The entire hair care routine in the Victorian era was elaborate and time-consuming. Women were expected to brush their hair 100 strokes every night to distribute the natural oils and keep it shiny. But they weren't supposed to wash it very often, maybe once a month, because the soaps available were harsh and damaging. So instead, they used dry shampoos made from powders, or they applied various oils and paids to keep it manageable. The length was crucial too. Victorian, women rarely cut their hair. It was seen as a woman's crowning glory. Remember, the longer the better. Cutting your hair was something you did only in cases of severe illness, when you were too weak to care for it, or in mourning as a sign of grief. Some women went their entire lives without ever cutting their hair, from childhood to old age. Can you imagine decades of growth carefully, maintained, braided at night, styled during the day, never shortened? This meant that many women had hair that reached their waists, even their knees. This was beautiful, certainly, but also incredibly heavy and difficult to manage. Just washing hair that long in an era before running water and electric hair dryers was an all-day affair. You had to heat water, pour it into a basin, lean over, wash section by section, then somehow dry this massive amount of hair, usually by sitting near a fire or in the sun for hours, combing it repeatedly to prevent tangles. And if your hair wasn't naturally thick and full, that was a problem too. Victorian beauty standards demanded abundant hair. So women who were less blessed turned to false hair pieces. These were extensions essentially made from human hair that had been collected from other women. Often this hair came from servants who would sell their hair to wig makers for extra money. Or it came from women in extreme poverty who had nothing else to sell. The wealthy lady, with the elaborate updo, her hair piled high on her head in cascading curls, might very well be wearing hair that came from her own kitchen made. There's something deeply unsettling about that, isn't there? The way beauty standards created this economy of hair, where poor women sold parts of themselves so that rich women could look more beautiful, and everyone just accepted it as normal. But let's return to those curling tongs for a moment, because I want you to really understand how dangerous these were. Modern curling irons have temperature controls. They max out at around 350 to 400 degrees Fahrenheit. Professional stylists recommend not exceeding 200 degrees if you can help it, to minimize damage. Victorian curling tongs, heated over an open flame, could easily reach 600, 700, even 800 degrees. There was no control, no regulation, no safety mechanism. If the maid got distracted, if she left them in the flame too long, if she misjudged the heat, the consequences could be severe. And it wasn't just burns. The repeated heat damage made hair brittle and prone to breaking. Split ends were universal. Hair that had been curled with tongs for years would develop this dry, straw-like texture, especially at the ends. So, women had to use more oils, more pomades, more treatments to try to restore some softness and shine, which made their hair heavier and greasier, which meant they needed more powder to absorb the grease, which made their hair drier. It was a vicious cycle, and there was no real escape from it, because you couldn't just stop styling your hair. That wasn't an option. Some women tried alternative methods. Rag curls, where you wrapped small sections of damp hair around strips of fabric and slept on them, were popular because at least they didn't involve fire. They were uncomfortable to sleep in, and the results were often frizzy rather than the smooth, uniform curls that were fashionable. Paper curls worked similarly. You'd wrap hair around pieces of stiff paper, secure them, sleep, or go about your day, then unwrap them hours later, hoping for decent curls. But again, the results were unpredictable. The reality was, if you wanted fashionable curls, really good ones, the kind that held their shape all day and looked elegant rather than messy, you needed heat. You needed those terrifying, dangerous, hair-destroying curling tongs, and so women used them every day, risking burns, risking damage, risking scars, because the social consequences of not maintaining proper hair were worse than any physical danger. Let me share one more detail that I think really drives home how embedded this was in daily life. In the mail-order catalogues of the time, Sears, Montgomery Ward, Marshall Field's, these huge catalogues that families would page through to order everything from farm equipment to fancy dresses. Curling tongs were right there alongside other household necessities. You could order them for about $4.50 in modern money in the 1895 Montgomery Ward catalog. They were as common, as ordinary, as unremarkable as buying a new cooking pot or a sewing needle. This wasn't seen as a luxury or a vanity item. It was seen as a basic necessity for any household with women or girls in it. Just like you needed a stove and a washboard and a broom, you needed curling tongs. Because properly styled, hair wasn't optional. It was required, expected, demanded by every social norm of the time. And think about what that meant for young girls growing up in this era. From the moment their hair was long, enough to style, probably around age 10 or 11, they were being taught that their natural hair was unacceptable, that they needed to heat it, curl it, manipulate it, damage it, every single day in order to be presentable. Imagine a childhood where every morning begins with the smell of singed hair and the anxiety of hot metal near your face. That was normal. That was just what women did. The irony, of course, is that all of this damage was being done in pursuit of beautiful hair, hair that looked healthy, lustrous, abundant, perfectly styled. But the very methods used to achieve that look were destroying the hair's natural health. It's the same paradox we saw with corsets and crinolines. The pursuit of the ideal actually undermines the reality, but the image, the appearance matters more than the substance. Better to have damaged hair that looks good than healthy hair that doesn't meet fashion standards. By the early 1900s, electric curling irons were finally invented. These were safer, more controllable, less likely to cause severe burns. But even then, women continued to damage their hair in pursuit of the perfect curl, the perfect wave, the perfect style. The tools changed. The underlying pressure remained the same. So Harriet finally finishes her morning hair routine. Her maid has created an elaborate updo with cascading curls, and it looks beautiful. But Harriet's scalp stings in a few places where the tongs got too close. Her hair feels dry and brittle to the touch, and she knows that in about 6 hours, this whole elaborate creation will start to droop and fall, and she'll need to refresh it all over again. But she stands up, looks in the mirror, and smiles because she looks fashionable. She looks proper. She looks like the woman society expects her to be. And that's what matters. We've explored the devices that shaped women's bodies, the cages they wore, and the tools they used to meet impossible beauty standards. But all of these visible devices, the corsets and crinolines and curling tongs, they were just the beginning. Because the Victorian obsession with beauty went deeper than that. Literally, women weren't just shaping what was on the surface. They were willing to poison themselves, to ingest toxic substances, to apply deadly chemicals to their skin, all in the pursuit of the perfect pale, flawless complexion. And that story is darker, stranger, and more disturbing than anything we've talked about so far. So, stay close, keep breathing, because we're about to discover just how far Victorian women were willing to go, and just how much they were willing to risk for beauty. If you think burning your hair with hot metal was extreme, wait until you hear what Victorian women were willing to put into and onto their bodies for beauty, because we're about to enter territory that's genuinely disturbing. We're talking about women knowingly, willingly consuming poison, applying radioactive substances to their faces, dropping deadly nightshade into their eyes, all in the name of achieving one very specific beauty ideal: pale skin. Skin so white it was almost translucent. Skin that announced to the world without a single word that you were wealthy, virtuous, pure, and refined. And the lengths women went to achieve that look, they're almost unbelievable. Let me introduce you to someone. Her name is Beatrice, and it's 1885. She's 23 years old, unmarried, and desperate to attract a suitable husband. Her family is respectable, middle class, but their finances are precarious. Beatrice needs to marry well, not just for love or companionship, but for survival. Her entire future depends on it. And in the marriage market of Victorian England, beauty is currency. The more beautiful you are, the more options you have, the better match you can secure. But Beatrice has a problem. Her complexion isn't perfect. She has freckles across her nose and cheeks, remnants of childhood summers spent outdoors. She has a slight natural tan, evidence that her family can't afford to keep her completely shaded from the sun at all times. And she has a few small blemishes, marks that in any other era might be considered completely normal, but in the Victorian age are seen as signs of poor health, bad character, even moral failing. So, Beatrice goes to see a woman who advertises herself as a beauty specialist, and this woman offers her a solution: arsenic wafers. These are small, thin wafers, almost like communion wafers, except they're laced with arsenic. You dissolve one in water and drink it, or you just place it on your tongue and let it dissolve. And the arsenic, this deadly poison, does something remarkable to your skin. It makes it pale, luminously, almost supernaturally pale. The arsenic affects your blood vessels, reducing blood flow to the surface of the skin. It gives you that coveted alabaster complexion, that translucent quality that was the absolute pinnacle of Victorian beauty. Beatrice buys her first box of arsenic wafers. She takes one, then another, and she sees results. Her skin does get paler. The freckles seem to fade slightly. She looks more delicate, more refined, more like the porcelain beauties in the fashion magazines. So she keeps taking them. One a day, then two. Because the thing about arsenic is it's addictive, not in the psychological sense, but in the physical sense. Your body develops a tolerance. You need more to maintain the same effect. And if you try to stop suddenly, you feel terrible, weak, nauseous, shaky. So you take more. What Beatrice doesn't know, what none of these women know, is that they're slowly poisoning themselves to death. Arsenic accumulates in the body. It doesn't just pass through, it builds up in your tissues, your organs, your bones. Chronic arsenic poisoning causes hair loss, brittle nails, nerve damage, digestion, VE problems, and eventually organ failure. But these symptoms develop slowly over months or years. And Victorian doctors who don't fully understand toxicology yet often attribute them to other causes. Female, hysteria, nervous exhaustion, delicate constitution. They never think to ask, are you eating poison? And arsenic wafers weren't some underground black market item. They were advertised openly in ladies' magazines and sold in regular shops. Doctors sometimes even prescribed them because small doses of arsenic were thought to have medicinal properties. It was considered a tonic, something that could improve your overall health and appearance. The fact that it was also slowly killing you, that information took decades to become widely understood. But arsenic wasn't the only toxic substance Victorian women were using on their quest for perfect skin. Let's talk about something even more disturbing. Radium. Radium is a radioactive element discovered in 1898 by Marie Curie, and in the early 1900s, before people fully understood what radiation could do to the human body, radium was seen as almost magical. It glowed in the dark. It seemed to have mysterious, powerful properties. So naturally, entrepreneurs started putting it in everything. Radium water, radium chocolate, and radium face powder. The advertisements promised that radium would give your skin a beautiful, youthful glow. And in a way, it did. Literally, because radium is luminescent. Products containing radium would make your skin look like it was radiating light from within. Women would apply these powders and creams before going out in the evening, and under gaslight or candlelight, their faces would have this ethereal, otherworldly quality. What the advertisements didn't mention was that radium exposure causes cancer, bone decay, anemia, radiation poisoning. The women who use these products daily sometimes, for years, were exposing themselves to dangerous levels of radiation. Some developed jawbone necrosis where the bones of their jaw literally rotted away. Others developed tumors. Many died young from cancers that doctors at the time couldn't explain. Now, you might be thinking, surely not everyone used these extreme products. Surely some women stuck to safer options. And you're right, most women couldn't afford arsenic wafers or radium face powder anyway. These were expensive luxury items. But that doesn't mean the average Victorian woman was playing it safe with her beauty routine, because there were plenty of other dangerous substances available at every price point. Zinc oxide powder was one of the most popular face powders of the era, and it was actually safer than the alternatives. It gave skin a pale matte finish without lead or arsenic. But women who wanted more dramatic results turned to something called enamel. This was a thick paint-like substance that was applied to the face to create a completely flawless porcelain-like surface. It covered every blemish, every wrinkle, every imperfection, and it was supposed to last for days, even weeks, without washing it off. The problem? Enamel was made with lead and other toxic metals. It completely blocked your pores, preventing your skin from breathing, and it looked deeply unnatural. Your face became a mask, stiff and immobile. Women who used enamel extensively often developed severe skin problems, rashes, infections, permanent discoloration, and removing it was difficult and painful, often requiring harsh chemicals that damaged the skin even further. There was a woman in London, she called herself Madame Rachel, who ran a beauty salon on Bond Street in the mid-1800s. She offered expensive beauty treatments to wealthy women, including this enamel treatment. Her motto was beautiful, forever, for outrageous sums of M1. She promised to transform any woman into a timeless beauty. Women would arrive at her salon in covered carriages wearing veils so no one would recognize them because admitting you used cosmetics was still seen as shameful and improper. Madame Rachel's treatments were elaborate. She would apply layers of creams, powders, and enamels to completely resurface her clients' faces. She claimed to use ancient Eastern secrets, rare ingredients imported from exotic locations, but it was all a scam. Her products were mostly cheap chemicals and colored pastes. She was charging women hundreds of pounds for products that cost her pennies to make. And when her clients complained that the results weren't permanent, that their skin was getting worse instead of better, she would tell them they needed more treatments, more products, more money. Eventually, one of her clients, a woman who had spent her entire fortune on Madame Rachel's treatments, went to the authorities. Madame Rachel was arrested and convicted of fraud and blackmail. The trial was a sensation. It revealed not just her scam, but the desperation of Victorian women so afraid of losing their looks, so pressured by beauty standards that they would risk their health, their money, their reputations, for the promise of being beautiful forever. Let's talk about another shocking practice, belladonna. The name literally means beautiful lady in Italian. And it's also called deadly nightshade because it's deadly, extremely poisonous. Consuming even a small amount can cause hallucinations, seizures, and death. But Victorian women weren't eating it. They were putting it in their eyes. Why? Because belladonna causes your pupils to dilate widely, dramatically, and in the Victorian era, large, dark, luminous eyes were considered incredibly attractive. They made you look innocent, dull-like, eternally youthful. So women would put a few p of belladonna extract into their eyes before going out to social events. Their pupils would dilate so much that their eyes appeared almost entirely black. It created this intense, captivating gaze. The side effects: vision problems, extreme light, sensitivity, headaches, and if you used it regularly, potential blindness. Belladonna damages the optic nerve. It can cause permanent vision loss. But, again, these effects developed slowly. A woman might use Bellona for months, before noticing that her vision was becoming blurry, that she was having trouble seeing clearly in bright light, and by then, the damage was often irreversible. Can you imagine making that calculation, knowing that something might make you go blind, but using it anyway because having beautiful eyes tonight is more important than being able to see clearly in 10 years? That's the level of pressure we're talking about. That's how completely Victorian women had internalized the message that their appearance was their most valuable asset. And it wasn't just faces and eyes. Women were using toxic substances on their hair too. Ammonia-based products were extremely popular for hair care. Ammonia was used to stimulate hair growth, to remove unwanted body hair, to lighten hair color. Beauty books of the era are filled with recipes for ammonia-based treatments that you could make at home. Mix ammonia with this herb or that oil, apply it to your scalp, leave it on for an hour. The problem with ammonia, aside from the fact that it smells absolutely terrible, is that it's a caustic chemical. It burns, it damages skin and hair follicles. Women who used ammonia treatments regularly often developed severe scalp irritation, chemical burns, and, paradoxically, hair loss, the exact opposite of what they were trying to achieve. And because ammonia is volatile, inhaling the fumes could cause respiratory problems, headaches, and nausea. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of all of this isn't the individual products. It's the why. Why were women willing to do this to themselves? And the answer is both simple and deeply sad. Because Victorian society told them that their value as human beings was tied directly to their appearance, that a beautiful woman could marry well and secure her future, that an unattractive woman was doomed to spinsterhood, poverty, social irrelevance, that your face was your fortune. Let me tell you about the specific beauty ideal that was driving all of this toxic behavior. The Victorian ideal was the consumptive look. Yes, you heard that right. Tuberculosis, a deadly disease that was killing thousands of people every year, had somehow become the basis for a beauty standard. Because tuberculosis made people pale, made them lose weight, made their eyes appear larger and more luminous, made them look delicate and ethereal. So perfectly healthy women were trying to look sick, they were trying to mimic the appearance of a fatal disease. This is why extreme paleness was so prized. This is why women wanted to look so delicate they might faint at any moment. Because in the twisted logic of Victorian beauty culture, appearing fragile and consumptive meant you looked fashionable. It meant you looked upper class because you clearly weren't doing manual labor that would give you a tan and strong muscles. It meant you looked like you needed to be taken care of, which was supposedly attractive to men. So women avoided the sun obsessively. They carried parasols everywhere, not just for rain but for shade. They wore gloves that covered their hands and forearms completely. They wore wide-brimmed hats and face, veils, anything to prevent their skin from darkening even slightly. Some women even stayed indoors as much as possible, living like vampires, only going out in the evening or on overcast days. And if prevention wasn't enough, if you already had a tan or freckles or any kind of natural color in your skin, you used skin lightening products. These ranged from relatively harmless things like lemon juice and cucumber masks to absolutely horrifying things like mercury-based creams. Mercury, like arsenic and lead, accumulates in the body and causes severe poisoning, but it does temporarily lighten skin. So it was widely used despite the dangers. There's a particularly sad irony in all of this. The women who needed their looks the most, the women from middle class, families who needed to attract wealthy husbands, were the ones most likely to use these dangerous products because they couldn't afford the time and lifestyle that would naturally keep them pale and unblemished. They couldn't afford to just stay indoors all day like wealthy ladies could. They had to be out and about, managing households, doing errands, being active in ways that exposed them to sun and wind and all the elements that would damage their complexions by Victorian standards. So they had to compensate. They had to use more products, more creams, more powders, more treatments. They had to work harder at achieving the look that came naturally to women who could afford complete leisure. And in doing so, they exposed themselves to more danger, more toxic substances, more long-term health consequences. The women who could least afford to be sick were the ones most likely to poison themselves in pursuit of beauty. Let me bring you back to Beatrice. She's been taking arsenic wafers for 6 months now. Her complexion is indeed paler, more refined. She's received compliments at social gatherings. A wealthy gentleman has started showing interest in her. Things seem to be working, but she's also started experiencing strange symptoms. Her hair is thinning, her hands shake slightly. She feels tired all the time, even after a full night's sleep. Her digestion is unpredictable. Sometimes she can't eat without feeling nauseous. She mentio. These symptoms to the beauty specialist who sold her the arsenic. The woman tells her this is normal. These are signs that the product is working, cleansing her system, refining her constitution. She should actually increase her dose if she wants to maintain the results. So Beatrice does. She takes more and she feels worse. But she also feels trapped, because if she stops, if she allows her complexion to return to its natural state with its freckles and slight tan, she'll lose the attention of that wealthy gentleman. She'll lose a chance at a good marriage. She'll lose everything she's been working toward. So, she makes a choice. She keeps taking the poison even though it's making her sick. Even though somewhere deep down, she suspects it might be dangerous because the alternative, being plain, being unfashionable, being unmarriageable, that feels more dangerous than arsenic. This is the truly insidious nature of Victorian beauty culture. It wasn't enforced by law. No one was forcing women to use toxic products, but the social and economic consequences of not conforming were so severe that women felt they had no choice. They were volunteering for their own poisoning because the system left them no other viable option. And before you think this is all ancient history that we've evolved beyond such foolishness, consider how many modern beauty products have been found to contain dangerous substances. Lead in lipstick, formaldehyde in nail polish and hair treatments, parabens and phthalates in everything. The specific poisons have changed, but the underlying dynamic hasn't. Women are still being told that their value is tied to their appearance, still being sold products that might harm them in exchange for the promise of beauty, still navigating a world where looking the right way can quite literally determine your economic and social opportunities. The Victorian woman, and with her arsenic wafers, might seem like a relic from another world. But the pressure she felt, the calculations she made, the risks she was willing to take, those are still with us. They've just taken different forms. Beatrice eventually did marry that wealthy gentleman. She secured her future, but she paid for it with her health. By the time she was 30, her hair was thin and brittle. Her hands trembled constantly and she suffered from chronic digestive problems. She lived to 41, which was actually above average for the time, but her last years were marked by illness and pain, and she never knew, not for certain, what caused her decline. She died thinking she had a delicate constitution, never realizing she'd spent years slowly poisoning herself in pursuit of pale skin. Now, we've explored the toxic substances women put in and on their bodies, but there's another layer to this story because Victorian medicine didn't just ignore these dangers. It actively participated in controlling women's bodies and behaviors through pseudoscience and diagnosis. And there's one diagnosis in particular, one supposed medical condition that has become legendary in its absurdity and its harm. You've probably heard of it. Female hysteria. And you've probably heard the Victorian doctors treated it with vibrators and orgasms. But here's the thing, that story, it's almost entirely false. And the truth is, actually far more disturbing. So breathe, settle deeper. Because we need to talk about what Victorian medicine really did to women and how the myth we believe today tells us something important about what we want to believe about the past. Here's a story you've probably heard before. Victorian doctors believed that women were prone to a mysterious illness called hysteria. The symptoms could be almost anything: anxiety, insomnia, irritability, fainting spells, even just a general tendency to cause trouble. And the treatment? Well, this is where the story gets interesting. According to popular belief, doctors would perform pelvic massages on their female patients, stimulating them to what was called a hysterical paroxysm, which we now recognize as an orgasm. And when doctors got tired of doing this manually, they invented the vibrator to make the job easier. It's a scandalous story, a titillating story, and it's been repeated in books, documentaries, museum exhibits, even a major Hollywood film. There's just one problem. It's almost entirely false. Now, before you think I'm about to ruin a perfectly good piece of historical gossip, let me be clear. The truth is actually more disturbing than the myth, because the real story of female hysteria isn't about doctors secretly pleasuring women under the guise of medicine. It's about how the medical establishment used diagnosis as a weapon to control women's behavior, to pathize female autonomy, and to enforce strict gender roles through the authority of science. And understanding the difference between the myth and the reality tells us something important about how we think about the past and about women's bodies. Even today, let me take you back to 1859. A physician makes a claim in a medical journal that approximately 1/4 of all women suffer from hysteria. 1/4? That's an epidemic. That's millions of women across England, Europe, and America supposedly afflicted with this mysterious condition. And what were the symptoms? Well, that's where it gets complicated. Because according to Victorian medical texts, hysteria could manifest as almost anything: faintness, nervousness, insomnia, fluid retention, muscle, spasms, shortness of breath, irritability, loss of appetite for food or for intimacy. And here's my favorite one: a tendency to cause trouble. Do you see what's happening here? Hysteria wasn't a medical diagnosis. It was a catch-all category for any behavior or symptom that doctors couldn't explain or didn't want to deal with. Woman feeling anxious about her restricted life. Hysteria. Woman questioning her husband's authority. Hysteria. Woman expressing sexual desire or, conversely, lack of sexual desire. Either way, hysteria. It was brilliantly insidious because it made women's complaints, their very real physical and emotional symptoms, into evidence of their own inherent instability. The word hysteria itself comes from the Greek word for uterus. The ancient Greeks believed that the uterus could wander around inside a woman's body, causing all sorts of problems. By the Victorian era, doctors knew that wasn't literally true, but they still believed that the female reproductive system was the source of women's supposed emotional and mental fragility. Having a uterus made you unstable, irrational, prone to mysterious ailments. It was biological determinism at its finest. Your anatomy was your destiny, and your destiny was to be weak. So what were the actual treatments for hysteria? This is where we need to separate fact from fiction. The popular story, the one about pelvic massage and vibrators, comes primarily from a book published in 1999 called The Technology of Orgasm by historian Rachel Maines. In this book, Maines argued that Victorian doctors routinely treated hysteria by manually stimulating women to orgasm, and that the electromechanical vibrator was invented to make this process more efficient. It's a compelling narrative. It's been cited in dozens of scholarly works. It won awards. A documentary was made based on it in 2007, a Tony-nominated play in 2009, a film starring Maggie Gyllenhaal in 2011. The story has been repeated so often that most people, even educated people, even historians, accept it as established fact. But in 2018, two research, as Hy Lieberman and Eric Schatzberg, decided to actually check Maine's sources. They went back to every medical text, every advertisement, every piece of evidence that Maine had cited in support of her argument, and what they found was shocking. None of the sources actually supported her claims, not one. Maines had cited texts about vibrators, but those texts recommended using them for muscle aches, for pain relief, not for treating female patients' genitals. She had cited texts about hysteria treatment, but those texts didn't mention genital massage or orgasms at all. Lieberman and Schatzberg published their findings in an academic journal, essentially debunking the entire vibrator hysteria story. And yet, the myth persists because it's a good story. It's scandalous enough to be interesting, but sanitized enough to be acceptable. It lets us feel smugly superior to the Victorians while also being slightly titillated by their supposed sexual hypocrisy. But it's not true. So what actually happened? What did Victorian doctors really do to women diagnosed with hysteria? The truth is less sensational but far more harmful. The primary treatments for hysteria were rest, isolation, and the removal of mental stimulation. This is best exemplified by something called the rest cure, popularized by a neurologist named Silas Weir Mitchell in the 1870s. The rest cure went like this. A woman diagnosed with hysteria or nervous exhaustion would be confined to bed, often for weeks or months. She was forbidden from sitting up, from walking, from doing any physical activity. She was fed a rich diet of milk and meat to build up her strength. But most importantly, she was prohibited from any mental activity. No reading, no writing, no visitors who might engage her in stimulating conversation, no needlework or any other hobby that required concentration. She was supposed to just lie there doing absolutely nothing, letting her over-excited female brain calm down. Can you imagine being an intelligent, active woman with thoughts and feelings and complaints about your restricted life and having a doctor respond by literally putting you in bed and taking away your books? It was psychological torture masquerading as medical treatment, and it was widely practiced, considered cutting-edge medicine, recommended by the most respected physicians of the era. There's a famous short story called The Yellow Wallpaper, written in 1892 by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. It's a semi-autobiographical account of a woman prescribed the rescuer. The narrator is confined to a room with yellow wallpaper, forbidden from writing or any mental activity. And slowly over the course of the story, the enforced idleness drives her genuinely mad. She begins to see women trapped behind the patterns in the wallpaper, struggling to escape. By the end, she believes she herself is one of those women crawling around the room, having completely lost her grip on reality. Gilman wrote this story based on her own experience with the rescuer. She had been prescribed it by Silas Weir Mitchell himself after the birth of her daughter, when she was experiencing what we would now recognize as postpartum depression. The treatment made her so much worse that she nearly lost her mind completely. She eventually cured herself by ignoring Mitchell's advice, resuming her writing and engaging her brain again. And she wrote The Yellow Wallpaper specifically to warn other women about the dangers of the rescue. But the rescue wasn't the only treatment. Some women diagnosed with hysteria were sent to asylums. Yes, mental institutions. Because if hysteria was severe enough, if a woman was particularly difficult or troublesome or showed signs of genuine mental distress, she could be committed. And once inside an asylum, her fate was largely out of her control. She might be kept there for months, years, even decades, depending on when or if her family decided she was cured enough to return home. Inside asylums, treatments ranged from relatively benign, like hydrotherapy, where patients were given baths or showers at various temperatures, to genuinely horrific, like physical restraints, forced feeding, or various experimental procedures that we would now recognize as torture. The key thing to understand is that women had very little agency in these situations. A husband could commit his wife. A father could commit his daughter. The diagnosis of hysteria became a tool for controlling inconvenient women. There were also other treatments that were less extreme, but still revealing. Cold baths, bland food, removal of stimulants like coffee or tea, enforced exercise or enforced rest, depending on what the doctor thought was needed, seclusion from society. And here's a particularly telling one: marriage. unmarried women were thought to be more prone to hysteria because they weren't fulfilling their natural role. So doctors would literally prescribe marriage as a cure. Find a husband, have children, and your symptoms will disappear. Because apparently what hysterical women really needed was more domestic responsibility and less autonomy. Now you might be wondering, where does the vibrator fit into all of this? Because electromechanical vibrators did exist in the Victorian era. They were invented. They were used, just not for what the popular story claims. A British physician named Joseph Mortimer Granville patented an electromechanical vibrator in the early 1880s, but Granville designed it for men, specifically to treat muscle aches and pain. In his writings, he explicitly said it should not be used on women, and certainly not for hysteria. He was worried it might be seen as improper or sexual. Vibrators were advertised in medical journals and sold to doctors, but they were marketed as general massage devices for muscle relief. They were also sold to consumers for home use, advertised in women's magazines alongside sewing machines and kitchen gadgets. But these advertisements emphasized health, vitality, and relief from everyday aches and pains. They didn't mention hysteria. They didn't mention women's reproductive health. They were presented as wholesome, respectable devices that happened to vibrate. Did some women use these devices for sexual pleasure? Almost certainly. Did they buy them knowing full well what they were really for? Probably. But that's different from doctors prescribing them as medical treatment for hysteria. The vibrator for hysteria story is a myth that emerged much later, a misunderstanding of Victorian sexual culture and medical practice that has been repeated so often it became accepted as fact. So why does the myth persist? Why do we want to believe the vibrator story so badly? I think it's because it offers a kind of comforting narrative about the past. It lets us imagine Victorian doctors as bumbling and hypocritical, touching women sexually while pretending it was medicine, too repressed to even recognize what they were doing. It makes the Victorians look silly rather than sinister. It's a story about sexual ignorance rather than about systematic oppression. But the real story of female hysteria is much darker. It's about how medicine was used to pathize normal female emotions and behaviors. It's about how women who expressed frustration with their limited lives, who showed anger or ambition or independence, could be labeled as sick and subjected to treatments designed to break their will. It's about how the authority of science was used to enforce gender roles and punish nonconformity. Think about what that diagnosis really meant. Imagine why, or a Victorian woman, intelligent and curious but confined to domestic life. You read, you think, you have opinions. You feel frustrated by your lack of options, your lack of autonomy. Maybe you express this frustration to your husband or your father. Maybe you seem sad or anxious or irritable. And instead of anyone asking whether your life circumstances might be causing these feelings, instead of considering that maybe your environment is the problem, a doctor examines you and declares that you have hysteria, that you're sick, that your very nature as a woman makes you unstable. And the cure for this sickness to remove even more of your autonomy, to confine you, to isolate you, to take away the few activities, reading, writing, socializing that might actually bring you joy or mental stimulation. You're being punished for symptoms caused by restriction with even more restriction. It's a perfectly closed loop of control. There's a documented case from the late 1800s of a woman who was committed to an asylum for hysteria. Her symptoms: she had argued with her husband about finances. She had questioned his business decisions. She had suggested she might want to work outside the home. Her husband consulted a doctor who agreed she was showing signs of dangerous hysteria. She was committed against her will and kept in the asylum for 3 years. When she was finally released, she'd become exactly what they wanted: quiet, compliant, broken. She never questioned her husband again. That's what hysteria diagnosis really did. It wasn't about orgasms and pleasure. It was about submission and control. Now, did Victorian doctors genuinely believe hysteria was a real medical condition? Most of them, yes. They weren't mustache-twirling villains consciously oppressing women for fun. They were products of their time working within a medical framework that saw women as inherently weaker and more unstable than men. They believed they were helping. They believed their treatments were therapeutic. And that's almost more disturbing than if they'd been deliberate villains, because it shows how completely gender bias can be embedded in supposedly objective science. The diagnosis of female hysteria began to decline in the early 20th century. Why? Partly because of advances in medical science. Doctors began to understand specific conditions: epilepsy, thyroid disorders, depression, anxiety that had previously been lumped under the hysteria umbrella. Partly because of changes in women's social roles as women gained more rights, more education, more opportunities outside the home. The idea that simply being female made you prone to nervous collapse became less tenable. But also, I think because women themselves started pushing back. The rise of feminism in the late 1800s and early 1900s gave women language to talk about their oppression. They could say, "I'm not sick. My circumstances are sick. The restrictions placed on me are the problem, not my reaction to those restrictions." And slowly, very slowly, some doctors began to listen. By the 1920s, female hysteria as a diagnosis was largely abandoned in medical literature. But the underlying attitudes, the idea that women's complaints shouldn't be taken seriously, that women's pain is somehow psychological rather than physical, that women are more emotional and less rational than men, those attitudes didn't disappear. They just took new forms. Even today, women are more likely than men to have their pain dismissed by doctors, to be told their symptoms are psychological or stress-related, to be prescribed anti-anxiety medication instead of being given thorough examinations. Studies have shown that women wait longer in emergency rooms, receive less pain medication, and are less likely to be taken seriously when they describe their symptoms. The specific diagnosis of hysteria is gone, but the skepticism toward women's reported experiences of their own bodies, that's still with us. So the myth of doctors treating hysteria with orgasms is false, but it's a comforting false story. It lets us laugh at Victorian prudishness and feel good about how far we've come. The truth that hysteria diagnosis was used to silence and control women, that medicine participated in enforcing gender oppression, that women were isolated and institutionalized for expressing normal human emotions. That's less comfortable, but it's what actually happened. And we need to understand that truth if we want to recognize how medical bias against women continues today. The vibrator story tells us what we want to believe about the Victorians, that they were sexually repressed hypocrites who accidentally gave women pleasure while trying to cure them. The reality tells us something more important, that systematic oppression doesn't always look like obvious cruelty. Sometimes it looks like a concerned doctor prescribing bed rest. Sometimes it comes wrapped in the language of care and cure. And sometimes the most effective forms of control are the ones that convince you that your dissatisfaction, your anger, your very reasonable response to an unreasonable situation is evidence that something is wrong with you. Victorian women were told that their bodies, their emotions, their very nature made them sick, and the treatments for that supposed sickness stripped away even more of their autonomy and humanity, all in the name of medicine, all under the authority of science, all with the best intentions. Now, we've talked about how Victorian women's bodies were controlled through clothing, through dangerous beauty practices, and through medical diagnosis. But there's still so much more to uncover about their daily lives, because all of these restrictions, all of these devices and treatments and diagnosis, they existed within a larger context of daily routine, and that routine itself was controlled, structured, prescribed in ways that might surprise you. So, let's step back from the extreme examples and look at something more mundane but equally revealing: the simple act of getting dressed each day. Because when you understand just how many layers Victorian women wore, how much time it took, how much help they needed, you begin to see how even the most basic daily activities became mechanisms of control. Stay with me, we're going deeper still. You wake up in the morning, you take a shower, you pull on some clothes. Maybe it takes you 15 minutes if you're being careful about your outfit, half an hour if you're really putting effort in, and then you're done. You're dressed. You can leave the house, go to work, live your life. Now imagine if getting dressed took an hour every single day, and you couldn't do it alone. You physically needed another person to help you because some of the fasteners were on your back where you couldn't reach them. Some of the laces required two people pulling in opposite directions. Some of the layers were so heavy you needed help lifting them into place. And by the time you were finally dressed, you'd be wearing somewhere between 15 and 20 lb of fabric. That's the weight of a toddler or a large Thanksgiving turkey wrapped around your body all day long. This was the reality for Victorian women. And we're not talking about special occasions here. We're not talking about fancy ball gowns or wedding dresses. We're talking about regular everyday clothing, the outfit you'd wear to have breakfast with your family or receive morning visitors or go for a walk in the park. Getting dressed wasn't a simple preparation for the day. It was labor, physical labor that required time, assistance, and endurance. Let me walk you through it. Let's dress a Victorian woman together, layer by layer, and really understand what her morning routine entailed. We'll call her Dorothy. It's 1878, a typical Tuesday morning in Manchester. Dorothy is 28 years old, married, middle class. Her husband works as a clerk. They have 2 young children and employ one servant, a young woman named Mary, who serves as both lady's maid and general household help. Dorothy has been awake for about 20 minutes. She's performed her morning ablutions, washed her face and hands in the basin in her bedroom, and now she's ready to dress, but she can't start without Mary's help. So she waits, sitting in her nightgown, until Mary knocks on the door. Mary enters, carrying an armful of undergarments. These have been warming by the kitchen fire because even though it's summer, the bedroom is chilly in the early morning. The first item is the chemise, a simple cotton undergarment that goes directly against the skin. It's basically a long shirt that reaches to mid-thigh. Dorothy pulls it on over her head. Easy enough. This is the only layer she can manage completely on her own. Next come the drawers. Now this is where things get interesting. Victorian women's drawers were not like modern underwear. They were 2 separate legs, each one like a long tube of fabric that tied at the waist and extended down to just below the knee. And here's the crucial detail. They were open in the middle. There was no seam connecting them at the crotch. They stayed up by being tied around the waist with a drawstring or buttons, but the center was completely open. Why? Because of what came next, the corset. Once Dorothy was laced into her corset, she would not be able to bend at the waist. She would not be able to reach down to lift up layers of skirts. So if her drawers were closed, she would have no way to use the toilet without completely undressing. The open crotch design meant she could sit on a chamber pot or privy and everything just, well, worked without needing to remove anything. It's ingenious in a way, but it's also a perfect illustration of how Victorian women's clothing was so restrictive that even basic biological functions had to be engineered around your underwear, had to be designed to accommodate the fact that your outer clothing made normal movement impossible. So Dorothy ties on her drawers. Then come the stockings. Silk, if you're wealthy, cotton or wool if you're not. These go up to just above the knee and are held in place by garters, ribbons, or elastic bands that tie around the leg. Dorothy sits on the edge of the bed while Mary helps her smooth the stockings and tie the garters, making sure they're snug, but not so tight they cut off circulation. Now comes the corset. We've already talked about corsets, so I won't belabor this, but I want you to understand how this fits into the larger sequence. Mary wraps the corset around Dorothy's torso over the chemise. It has a buskin front, a rigid piece that fastens with hooks, so that part clicks together relatively easily. But the back is all lacing. Mary starts at the top and begins to pull the laces through the eyelets, gradually tightening, gradually cinching Dorothy's waist inward. This takes about 10 minutes. Dorothy has to stand very still, breathing shallowly while Mary works. By the time it's done, Dorothy's waist has been reduced by about 3 in. She can feel the pressure on her ribs, the restriction in her breathing. This is normal. This is every day. Over the corset goes a corset cover, a light cotton garment that hides the lines of the bone and laces beneath the outer dress. It also protects the dress from the metal and whalebone of the corset, which could snag delicate fabrics. Then come the petticoats. And here's where the weight really starts to add up. Depending on the fashion of the moment and Dorothy's social class, she might wear anywhere from 3 to 5 petticoats. Each one is a full skirt that ties around the waist. The innermost ones are plain white cotton or linen. The outer ones might be more elaborate with ruffles or lace at the hem that might peek out beneath the dress. Now, in 1878, a fashion silhouette requires fullness at the back. So Dorothy also needs to put on what's called a bustle pad. This is a small cushion or framework. We'll talk more about bustles in a moment. That ties around her waist and sits at the small of her back just above her bottom. Its job is to make her skirt project outward behind her, creating that characteristic Victorian posterior emphasis. Think about what Dorothy is wearing now. Chaise, drawers, stockings, corset cover, 3 petticoats, bustle pad. That's 8 separate items, and we haven't even gotten to the actual dress yet. She's been standing here for about 30 minutes. And all of this is underneath, invisible, just the foundation for what people will actually see. Now comes the dress itself. Dorothy's day dress is made of medium-weight wool, appropriate for summer. The skirt and bodice are separate pieces, which is typical for this era. Mary helps Dorothy step into the skirt, which fastens at the back with hooks and eyes. The skirt is full, sweeping with elaborate drapery at the back that cascades over the bustle. It weighs about 5 pounds on its own. Then the bodice. This is fitted with long sleeves and a high neck because it's day wear. Modest, respectable. The bodice fastens up the back with tiny buttons, dozens of them, each one requiring Mary's careful attention. Dorothy has to stand with her arms slightly raised while Mary works her way from the waist up to the nape of the neck, buttoning each one. This take another 10 minutes. Already we're at 45 minutes, and Dorothy still isn't fully dressed. Her hair hasn't been done. She needs shoes, which button up the side and require a special hook tool to fasten. She might need a belt or a brooch to complete the outfit. If she's going out, she'll need a hat, gloves, possibly a shawl or jacket. But let's pause here and really think about what we've just described. Dorothy is now wearing approximately 15 lb of clothing. The corset is pressing against her ribs and compressing her internal organs. The layers of petticoats and the heavy wool skirt are hot. Even in summer, the high neck of her bodice feels constricting, and she can't remove any of this without help. She can't even reach the buttons on her own back. She is quite literally trapped in her clothing until Mary returns at the end of the day to undress her. Now you might be thinking, okay, but surely working-class women didn't go through all this. Surely women who had to actually work, who didn't have servants, simplified things. And you'd be partly right. Working-class women wore fewer layers. Their corsets were looser. Their fabrics were cheaper and less elaborate. But they still wore corsets. They still wore multiple petticoats. They still wore long, heavy skirts. Because even for working women, appearing in public without proper undergarments was unthinkable. It marked you as immoral, improper, possibly even as a prostitute. So, a factory worker, a shop girl, a laundress. She would get up even earlier than Dorothy to struggle into her own layers of clothing, usually without any help, before heading to work. She'd labor all day in a hot factory or shop, corseted and layered, unable to move freely. And then she'd come home and somehow manage to undress herself, reaching awkwardly behind her back to unfasten what she could, maybe sleeping in some of her undergarments because it was too difficult to get in and out of everything daily. The class difference wasn't whether you wore restrictive clothing, it was whether you had help dealing with it. Let me tell you about one particularly absurd aspect of this whole system. The buttons. Victorian dress is often fastened with dozens, sometimes over 100 tiny buttons. And I mean tiny. Some of them were barely a 4" in diameter. They went all the way up the back or sometimes down the front, each one requiring careful manipulation through a tight buttonhole. This wasn't just inconvenient, it was deliberately designed this way because buttons that you couldn't reach yourself that required another person to fasten were a sign of status. They announced that you had servants, that you didn't need to dress yourself, your clothing was proof of your social position. There's a wonderful detail in etiquette books from this era. They advise that a lady should never be seen fastening her own clothing in public. If a button came undone or a hook slipped, she should retire to a private room to fix it or discreetly ask a female friend for assistance, because being seen managing your own fastening suggested that you didn't have proper help at home. It lowered your social standing. So women would walk around with broken fastenings, uncomfortable and insecure in their clothing rather than reveal that they might have to dress themselves. Can you imagine? Your button pops off, and instead of just fixing it, you have to calculate the social implications of reaching behind your back in front of others, the anxiety, the constant vigilance, the mental energy spent on maintaining appearances. And then there's the question of mobility. In all these layers, how did Victorian women actually move? The answer is carefully and with great limitation. Sitting required technique. You had to approach a chair, turn around, press down on the front of your skirt with your hands while you sat, so it didn't fly up, and then carefully arrange all the fabric around you. The bustle made sitting particularly awkward. You couldn't lean back against the chair comfortably, because this padded protrusion was in the way, so you had to sit forward, perched on the edge, maintaining perfect posture because the structure of your clothing literally prevented you from relaxing. Walking was constrained too. The weight of the skirts and petticoats meant you couldn't move quickly. The corset prevented you from bending at the waist, so you couldn't look down easily to see where you were stepping. If you dropped something, you had to squat straight-legged or ask someone else to retrieve it. Stairs were challenging, requiring you to lift the heavy skirts with both hands to avoid tripping, and forget about any kind of running or vigorous movement. It was physically impossible. This had real consequences. There are documented cases of Victorian women who died in fires because they couldn't run in their clothing, women who drowned because the weight of their wet skirts pulled them under, women who suffered injuries from falls because they couldn't catch themselves, couldn't move quickly to avoid danger. The clothing didn't just restrict, it endangered. And bathrooms. Let's talk about bathrooms for a moment, or rather the lack thereof. Most Victorian homes didn't have indoor plumbing until late in the era, so women had to use chamber pots in their bedrooms or outhouses in the yard. Now, imagine trying to use an outhouse in winter, wearing 15 lb of clothing with a corset preventing you from bending and multiple layers of skirts that you have to somehow lift and manage while squatting over a hole. It was a logistical nightmare. Women would avoid drinking water during the day just to minimize the number of times they'd have tea or deal with this ordeal. Some wealthy homes had special toilet chairs, basically a chair with a chamber pot concealed inside it, upholstered and decorative so it looked like regular furniture. This at least allowed women to sit rather than squat. But the fundamental problem remained. You were wearing clothing that was fundamentally incompatible with basic biological functions. Let me share a detail that really drives this home. In the 1870s and 80s, there was a brief fashion for what were called walking skirts. These were skirts that were slightly shorter, only reaching to the ankle rather than trailing on the ground, and slightly less voluminous. They were designed for women who wanted to walk outdoors for exercise, which was becoming more acceptable, And this minor adjustment, raising the hem by maybe 3 in and reducing the fabric by maybe a yard, was considered scandalously practical. Fashion magazines debated whether such skirts were proper. Etiquette writers worried that they made women look too masculine, too active, too free, 3 in. That's how little room there was for modification. That's how tightly controlled the standards were. Now, all of this daily dressing routine, this elaborate layering system, it served multiple purposes. Yes, it created the fashionable silhouette. Yes, it maintained modesty, but it also accomplished something else, something more insidious. It made women dependent. If you can't dress yourself, you need help. If you need help, you need to stay near that help. If you're corseted and layered and wrapped in 15 lbs of fabric that you can't remove alone, you can't easily leave, can't easily travel, can't easily escape, it's a form of control that doesn't announce itself as control. No one says we're restricting your movement to keep you subordinate. Instead, fashion says, this is beautiful, this is proper, this is respectable, and the rest are. Action becomes self-enforcing. You police your own mobility. You accept the limitations as natural, as necessary as the price of being a proper woman. There's a heartbreaking quote from a Victorian woman's diary that I came across. She writes, "I long to run just once to feel what it's like to run freely as I did as a child. But my clothing makes it impossible. And even if it didn't, I'm told ladies don't run. So I walk slowly, always slowly, and I wonder what it would feel like to move through the world unburdened." She wrote that when she was 26 years old, 26, and she couldn't remember the last time she had run, couldn't imagine when she might run again. Movement itself had become gendered, running, jumping, climbing, moving quickly and freely through space. These were masculine activities. Women walked, women sat, women stood still and looked decorative, and their clothing enforced this at every moment. Dorothy finally finishes dressing. It's taken 50 minutes. Her feet hurt from standing so long. She's already feeling warm in all the layers. The corset is tight enough that she knows she'll feel slightly breathless all day, but she looks proper. She looks respectable. She looks like the woman society expects her to be, and that's what matters. She'll wear this outfit for the next 12 to 14 hours. She can't remove it for a midday rest, can't loosen it when it gets too hot, can't adjust it when it becomes uncomfortable. She's locked in until evening when Mary will return to help her undress, a process that will take another 20 minutes of unlacing, unbuttoning, untying, and she'll do it all again the next day and the day after that and every day for the rest of her life. Because this is what being a woman means in her world. This is normal. We've talked about individual devices, individual restrictions, but this, the daily routine of dressing, shows how all those NTS work together to create a comprehensive system of control. The corset restricted breathing and movement. The layers added weight and heat. The fastenings created dependence. The silhouette limited mobility, and the time investment, nearly an hour every morning and every evening, consumed energy and resources that could have been spent on other activities, on reading, on creative work, on anything other than the endless labor of maintaining an acceptable appearance. But the story of Victorian women's daily lives isn't just about the clothing they wore. It's also about the specific garments that evolved over time, each one bringing its own unique set of challenges and restrictions. And there's one device in particular that deserves its own exploration, a device that was so awkward, so uncomfortable, so utterly impractical that it became a symbol of Victorian fashion excess. The bustle, a padded or structured protrusion worn at the small of the back that made sitting nearly impossible and walking an exercise in balance. So let's continue our journey. Let's explore how the bustle evolved, how women managed to navigate daily life while wearing what was essentially a shelf attached to their backsides, and what it reveals about the absurdity of prioritizing appearance over function. Stay close. We're diving deeper into the strange architecture of Victorian fashion. What if I told you that Victorian fashion designers looked at women saw that they could still sit down relatively comfortably, and decided that was a problem that needed solving, that they invented a device specifically designed to make the simple act of sitting in a chair into a complex negotiation between your body and the architecture strapped to your backside. Welcome to the era of the bustle, possibly the most absurd, most impractical, most bizarrely specific fashion device ever created. And it dominated women's fashion in various forms for over 2 decades. The bustle wasn't just a fashion choice, it was a declaration. It said, I am so wealthy, so leisured, so free from the necessity of physical labor or practical movement, that I can afford to wear a device that makes basic human activities nearly impossible, and somehow millions of women embraced it. Let's start at the beginning. The 1870s, the crinoline cage that we talked about earlier has fallen out of fashion. Women are tired of those enormous bell-shaped skirts that made them knock over furniture and catch on fire. Fashion is evolving. The silhouette is changing, and the change is moving everything backward, literally. Instead of skirts projecting out equally in all directions, all that volume, all that fabric, all that emphasis is shifting to the rear. Meet our friend for this section. Her name is Florence. It's 1874. Florence is 31 years old, a banker's wife, living in a comfortable townhouse in Boston. She considers herself quite fashionable. She reads all the latest ladies' magazines. She orders her dresses from the finest dressmakers. And right now, the absolute height of fashion is something called the Polonaise style, where the overcar-tee is gathered up and draped elaborately over the back of the underskirt, creating cascading folds and swags that emphasize the posterior. To achieve this look, Florence needs structure underneath. She needs something to hold all that draped fabric away from her body to create the fashionable projection. So, she wears what's called a bustle pad. It's a cushion stuffed with horsehair or cork, shaped like a crescent moon that ties around her waist and sits at the small of her back just above her bottom. It's relatively small, relatively soft. When Florence sits down, the pad compresses. It's not comfortable exactly, but it's manageable. She can sit in a chair if she perches forward. R&D slightly. She can ride in a carriage. She can navigate her daily life with only minor inconvenience. Florence thinks this is as extreme as fashion will get. She's wrong. By 1877, fashion takes a sharp turn towards something called the natural form, or quirus style. This is where things get truly restrictive. The silhouette becomes dramatically narrow. Skirts are no longer full. They're tight, fitted, wrapped snugly around the legs in a way that makes walking difficult. The bodice extends downward past the waist, sometimes all the way to the hips, creating a long, smooth line. It's called a quirus bodice because it looks like armor, like a breastplate extending down the torso. To achieve this ultra-slim look, women have to lace their corsets even tighter. The skirts are so narrow at the knee that walking requires tiny, mincing steps. Florence tries this fashion and finds it beautiful, but nearly immobilizing. She can barely climb stairs. She certainly can't sit down without her tight skirt riding up in an improper way. Fashion magazines actually publish instructions on how to walk in these dresses. Take steps no longer than the length of your foot. Keep your knees pressed together. Glide rather than stride. This natural form error lasts about 5 years and women hate it. It's too restrictive even by Victorian standards. They can barely move. They can't participate in the increasingly popular outdoor activities like tennis or cycling. Working-class women certainly can't function in these styles, so there's pushback. Women start complaining loudly. Fashion reformers call these styles oppressive and unhealthy, and slowly fashion begins to change again. And here's where it gets truly bizarre. Instead of moving toward more practical clothing, fashion swings in the opposite direction. The bustle comes roaring back, but not the small, soft cushion that Florence wore in the early 7 seconds. No, this is the shelf bustle era, and it's architectural. It's 1883. Florence is now 40 years old, and the fashion that has just emerged from Paris is unlike anything she's ever seen. The new bustle isn't a cushion, it's a rigid framework. It's made of steel wires or whalebone shaped into a structure that projects horizontally from the small of the back, creating a 90-degree angle. Imagine wearing a shelf, a literal shelf attached to your backside. The skirts that drape over this structure are elaborate, heavily decorated, often with a distinct horizontal line where the fabric extends straight out from the body before dropping straight down. Women start to look like they're wearing upholstered furniture. The silhouette is stiff, angular, almost geometric. It's the opposite of natural. It's proudly, defiantly artificial. Florence stands in her dressmaker shop, looking at herself in the mirror while wearing one of these new bustles for the first time. From the front, she looks normal, fashionable even, but from the side, she projects outward by nearly a foot. From the back, she looks like she's wearing a shelf that someone could place a tea tray on, which, according to some contemporary cartoons, is exactly what the bustle looked like it was designed for. Now here's the question. How do you sit down when you're wearing a rigid shelf attached to your backside? The answer is you don't. Not really. Not in any normal sense. Florence approaches a chair at a dinner party that evening. She's wearing her new bustle dress, feeling fashionable and modern. The chair is an ordinary dining chair with a back. Florence turns around, assesses the situation, and realizes the bustle won't compress. It won't fold. It's rigid steel. If she tries to sit back in the chair, the bustle will push her forward, forcing her to lean awkwardly over the table. So she does what every fashionable woman has learned to do. She sits on the very edge of the chair, her back perfectly straight, the bustle extending behind her into empty air, and she maintains this position for the entire meal. Her back starts to ache after about 20 minutes. By the end of the 2-hour dinner, she's in genuine pain. Her lower back muscles are cramping from the effort of holding herself upright without any back support. Her legs are tense from the constant effort of keeping herself balanced on the edge of the chair. When she finally stands up, she feels dizzy for a moment, her body protesting the sustained awkward position. And this is every meal, every social call, every moment of sitting for the next 6 years. Let me describe what these shelf bustles actually looked like, because I don't think most people understand how extreme they were. The framework was made of concentric half-hoops of steel, connected by vertical tapes, creating a cage-like structure. Some had springs or hinges that allowed slight movement, but most were completely rigid. The largest ones extended 18 in or more from the body. When women wearing these bustles stood side by side, they couldn't get close to each other. They were literally separated by 1.5 feet of metal and fabric on each side. Victorian cartoonists had an absolute field day with this fashion. Punch magazine published cartoon after cartoon mocking the bustle. One showed 2 women trying to pass each other in a doorway, their bustles jamming against the doorframe. Another showed a woman at a concert, her bustle so large that it blocked the view of everyone sitting behind her. Another depicted a man trying to embrace his wife, but the bustle kept them apart like a chastity device made of architecture and fabric. The cartoons were funny, but they were also documenting a real problem. These bustles were genuinely impractical. Women couldn't fit into spaces. They knocked things over when they turned around because the bustle extended so far behind them that they couldn't judge distances accurately. They had to learn entirely new ways of moving through the world. Getting in and out of carriages became a complex maneuver. You couldn't just step in and sit down. You had to enter sideways, position yourself carefully, and then sort of perch on the edge of the seat with the bustle extending over the side or into the space next to you. If 2 women wearing large bustles tried to ride in a carriage together, they often had to sit on opposite sides because there simply wasn't room for both bustles on one bench, and lying down, forget about it. You couldn't lie on your back because the bustle was in the way. Some women removed their bustles for sleep, But remember, the dress itself was designed to drape over the bustle. Without it, the dress lost its shape entirely. So if you wanted to rest during the day, say on a fainting couch, very Victorian, you had to lie on your side, always on your side, never on your back, never fully flat. Now, you might be wondering, surely, working-class women didn't wear these ridiculous things, and you'd be partially right. The most extreme shelf bustles were primarily worn by wealthy women who could afford to be impractical, but working-class women still wore smaller bustles because even they couldn't escape the fashion requirements entirely. A woman without any bustle at all would be seen as unfashionable, poor, possibly immoral. So they wore smaller, softer versions, little pads that at least gestured toward the fashionable silhouette, even if they couldn't afford the full architectural statement. Here's something fascinating, though. Some historians have argued that for working-class women, the bustle actually served a practical purpose because the weight and volume of the skirt was concentrated at the back rather than distributed evenly. It gave them more freedom of movement at the front. A laundress or a shop girl could bend forward over her work more easily because the front of her skirt wasn't in the way. The bustle held everything back, out of the workspace. It's a charitable interpretation, and there might be some truth to it, but it's also the kind of rationalization that people make when they're trapped in a system they can't change. Well, it's not that bad. Actually, it's kind of helpful if you think about it the right way. It's the mindset of someone trying to find silver linings in a fundamentally absurd situation. There's an interesting social context to the return of the bustle in the 1880s that's worth exploring. This was the era of what historians call the new woman. Increasing numbers of young women were choosing to delay marriage or not marry at all, pursuing education and careers instead. Women were entering the workforce in unprecedented numbers. In 1890, over 312 million women were employed outside the home. By 1900, that number had jumped to over 5 million. This was threatening to the established social order. Women working meant women having their own money, their own independence, their own lives outside of marriage and motherhood. So, there was significant cultural anxiety about women becoming too masculine, too independent, too powerful. And fashion responded. The return of the extreme bustle with its exaggerated femininity, its emphasis on the female form, its complete impracticality for any kind of work can be seen as a pushback against the new woman. It was fashion saying, no matter how much you want to work, no matter how much you want independence, you're still bound by these standards of femininity. You still have to dress like a lady. You still have to restrict your movement to maintain respectability. Some historians have even argued that the architectural, almost aggressive quality of the shelf bustle was a kind of power statement, as if women were saying, if we have to be decorative, we'll be so decorative we take up twice the space we used to. If we have to emphasize our femininity, we'll emphasize it so much it becomes impossible to ignore. It was assertion through exaggeration. I'm not entirely convinced by this interpretation. I think it gives too much credit to a fashion that was fundamentally restrictive and uncomfortable. But it's interesting to consider that maybe, just maybe, some women found a kind of defiant pleasure in wearing something so absurdly impractical, like they were exposing the ridiculousness of the whole system by taking it to its logical extreme. By 1889, the shelf bustle was starting to fade. Fashion moved on as it always does. The bustle shrank, became softer, eventually disappeared almost entirely by the early 1890s. Skirts became A-line, falling straight from the waist without any structural support underneath. Women could finally sit normally again. They could move through spaces without calculating bustle clearance. The relief must have been immense. But here's what strikes me about the whole bustle era, particularly those 6 years of shelf bustles. Women wore something that made sitting nearly impossible for 6 years. 6 years, that's over 2,000 days of perching on the edges of chairs. That's thousands of hours of back pain, of strained muscles, of physical discomfort, all in the name of fashion, all to maintain the proper silhouette, all to look respectable, and they didn't have to. There was no law requiring bustles, no punishment for not wearing one except social disapproval. But that disapproval was powerful enough to convince millions of women to voluntarily wear a device that made basic activities difficult and painful. That's the power of social control through fashion. It doesn't need enforcement. It just needs everyone to agree that this is how things are done, and the consequences of nonconformity. To feel worse than any physical discomfort. Florence finally stops wearing bustles in 1892. She's almost 50 years old. She's been restricted by fashion for over 30 years. Corsets, crinolines, tight natural form dresses, 2 different bustle eras, and now finally fashion is moving towards something slightly more rational. The skirts of the 1890s are still long and heavy, still require corsets underneath. But at least they don't require architectural supports. At least Florence can sit in a chair like a normal human being. She sits down in her drawing room one afternoon, settles back fully against the chair back for the first time in years, and almost cries from relief. Her back touches the upholstery. Her weight is distributed evenly. She's not perched, not straining, not holding herself up through sheer muscular effort. She's just sitting, simply sitting, and it feels like a luxury beyond measure. The bustle era teaches us something important about how far fashion was willing to go in the Victorian period. The corset restricted breathing. The crinoline created dangers. But the shelf bustle, it served no purpose whatsoever except to be impractical. It didn't make you look thinner or taller. It didn't conceal any supposed flaws. It just made your backside project outward in a rigid geometric shape that prevented normal sitting. That was its only function. And yet women wore it enthusiastically, fashionably for years. For because the alternative, being unfashionable, being unstylish, being seen as behind the times, that was worse than any physical discomfort the bustle could cause. We've explored the devices women wore, the layers they navigated, the furniture attached to their bodies, but there's another aspect of Victorian women's daily lives that we need to discuss, because all of this restrictive clothing, all of these elaborate fashion requirements, they had to be managed throughout the day. Women needed tools, devices they could carry with them to help maintain their appearance and deal with the consequences of being so completely wrapped and restricted, and Victorian ingenuity came up with a solution. A device that was part tool, belt, part jewelry, part mobile survival kit. Something that turned women into walking utility stations, carrying everything they might need to navigate their constrained world. Let's keep going. Let's discover the Victorian woman's answer to the smartphone, the shatter. Stay with me. We're almost there. Think about what you carry with you every day. Your phone, obviously, maybe your wallet, keys, perhaps a small bag with essentials, lip balm, tissues, hand sanitizer, everything you need to navigate your day, all within easy reach. You can access any of it in seconds without thinking about it. Victorian women had the same need. They needed things throughout the day. Small tools, emergency items, accessories. But they had a problem. Their dresses didn't have pockets. Well, they sometimes had pockets, but they were sewn into the layers of petticoats, accessed through slits in the overcart, and basically unreachable when you were wearing a corset that prevented you from bending at the waist and carrying a handbag everywhere. That was considered unfashionable and lower-ass for much of the era. Ladies didn't carry bags. Ladies had servants who carried things for them. But what about when you were away from home? What about the things you needed constantly throughout the day? Victorian ingenuity had an answer. It was called a châtain, and it was essentially a wearable tool belt disguised as jewelry. It was the Victorian woman's smartphone, her purse, her survival kit, all hanging from her waist, announcing to the world that she was prepared, organized, and capable. Let me introduce you to someone who would have worn one. Her name is Margaret. It's 1885. Margaret is the mistress of a comfortable middle-class household in Birmingham. He's 34 years old, married, with 3 children, and she manages a household that includes 2 servants, a cook and a housemaid. Margaret's days are full of tasks. She needs to oversee meals, manage household accounts, correspond with friends and family, receive visitors, supervise her children's lessons, and handle countless small emergencies that arise in daily life. And to do all of this effectively, Margaret wears a châtain. The word châtine comes from the French word for the mistress of a castle, the châtelaine. In medieval times, the lady of the castle would carry the keys to all the rooms, all the storage areas, all the important spaces on a chain at her waist. This was a symbol of her authority and responsibility. She literally held the keys to the kingdom. And that concept, that visual symbol of domestic authority, persisted into the Victorian era, evolved and elaborated into something much more complex. Margaret's châtain is made of silver-plated brass. It's beautiful, decorative, with intricate engravings of flowers and scroll work. It consists of a hook or clip at the top that attaches to the waistband of her dress. And from this hook hang several chains of varying lengths, and at the end of each chain is a different implement, a different tool, each one essential to Margaret's daily life. Let's go through what's hanging from Margaret's chatelaine this morning. First, there's a small pair of scissors in a decorative sheath. These are embroidery scissors, sharp and precise, useful for cutting thread, snipping loose strings, opening sealed letters, all sorts of small cutting tasks that come up throughout the day. Next to the scissors hangs a thimble holder, a little metal case that protects a silver thimble. Victorian ladies were expected to be skilled at needlework, and having a thimble always available meant Margaret could attend to mending or embroidery when Eve are needed. Then there's a pencil holder with a small pencil inside, ready for jotting down notes, making lists, recording household accounts. Beside it hangs a tiny notebook, no bigger than a playing card, with ivory leaves that can be written on with the pencil and then erased. It's the Victorian equivalent of a phone's notes app. But here's where it gets really interesting. Margaret's chatelaine also has a vinaigrette. This is a small decorative box about the size of a large pill box with a perforated lid. Inside is a small sponge soaked in aromatic vinegar or smelling salts. Why? Because Victorian women fainted a lot, whether from tight corsets restricting oxygen, from overheated rooms, from the stress and physical demands of daily life, or from social expectations that ladies should be delicate and prone to vapors. Fainting was common. The vinaigrette was emergency revival equipment. If you felt faint, you could open it, hold it under your nose, and the sharp, pungent smell would help bring you back to consciousness. If someone else fainted in your presence, you could assist them. Think about that for a moment. Fainting was so common that women carried specialized equipment to deal with it. It was built into the daily accessories of respectable life. That tells you something about how physically demanding it was just to exist in Victorian clothing. Margaret chatelaine also has a small watch case. Pocket watches were typically carried by men, but women needed to know the time too, so some chatter included a small watch suspended from one of the chains, visible when needed, but decorative enough to look like jewelry rather than like a practical timepiece. Time management was crucial for household management. Meals had to be served punctually. Social calls had specific, acceptable hours. Everything was regimented, scheduled, time-bound. And finally, Margaret's châtain has a seal. This is a small stamp with her family's initial or symbol carved into it, used for sealing letters with wax. Correspondence was a major part of a Victorian lady's day. You'd write letters to friends, to family members, to merchants and tradespeople, and each letter had to be properly sealed. Having a seal readily available on your chatter meant you could tend to correspondence efficiently without having to search for your seal every time. So that's 6 items, all hanging from chains at Margaret's waist, clinking softly together when she walks, always within reach, always available. She doesn't have to ask a servant to fetch scissors. She doesn't have to remember where she left her pencil. She doesn't have to search through drawers for smelling salts when a visitor feels faint. Everything she needs is right there, part of her outfit, part of her daily armor. Now, Margaret Chatelain is relatively modest. It's nice, well-made, but not ostentatious, but wealthy women. Their chatelaines were works of art made of solid gold or sterling silver, elaborately engraved, sometimes set with semi-precious stones. Some had 8 or 10 chains hanging from them, each one holding a different accessory. You might have a lorgnette, a pair of folding spectacles on a handle for reading, a small perfume bottle, a button hook for fastening the tiny buttons on shoes and gloves, a tiny telescope for viewing landscapes or theater performances, a memo pad with a mechanical pencil attached. The wealthiest women's chatelaines were essentially mobile luxury accessory kits, and the variety was enormous. There were specialized chatelaines for different purposes. A sewing chatter might include thread windows, needle cases, and measuring tapes. A nurse's chatter used in hospitals would have thermometers, scissors, safety pins, and styptics for stopping bleeding. These became essential equipment. F, or nurses in the late Victorian era. And you can still see echoes of them today in the pouches and tool belts that medical professionals wear. But here's what I find most fascinating about chatelaines. They were a solution to a problem that was entirely created by the clothing itself. If Victorian women's dresses had proper pockets, if they could bend to reach things, if they were allowed to carry practical bags without social censure, they wouldn't have needed chatelaines. The chatter was a workaround, a way to adapt to clothing that was fundamentally incompatible with the practical needs of daily life. And yet, women embraced them. They became fashion statements. Advertisements in ladies' magazines showed the latest châtain styles. Gift guides recommended them for birthdays and Christmas. Having an elaborate, well-equipped châtain became a sign of being organized, prepared, capable. It showed that you took your domestic responsibilities seriously, that you were ready for any household emergency. It was a visible symbol of competent womanhood. There's a wonderful photograph from the early 1900s of a hospital matron wearing her nurse's chatelaine. She's got at least 8 implements hanging from it. Scissors, a watch, a thermometer case, forceps, safety pins, and other tools I can't quite identify. She looks official, professional, ready for anything, and she's wearing her chatelaine with obvious pride. It's not just a tool, it's a uniform, a badge of office, a statement of her authority and expertise. The same was true for housewives, though perhaps less overtly. A woman wearing a well-maintained chatelaine with the right implements was showing the world that she was on top of her responsibilities, that her household ran smoothly because she was prepared, that she had the tools to handle whatever arose. In a society where women's primary role was domestic management, the chatelaine was visual proof that you were good at your job. Now you might be wondering, wasn't it heavy? Having all that metal and all those implements hanging from your waist all day? And yes, it was. A fully equipped chatter could weigh 2 or 3 lb. That might not sound like much, but remember, it's pulling down on your waistband all day long, creating a constant downward pressure. And Victorian waistbands were already under a lot of stress from the weight of skirts and petticoats. Add a chatter to that, and you had a significant load concentrated at one point on your body. Women sometimes complained of chatelaines causing bruising or discomfort, with a clip attached to the waistband. And if you wore a heavy chatter regularly, it could actually pull your dress out of shape over time, stretching the fabric at the waist, creating permanent distortion. But again, this discomfort was accepted as the price of preparedness and fashion. The social meaning of châtain varied by class, too. For upper-class women, a châtain was elegant, refined, a piece of decorative jewelry that happened to be functional. It showed leisure and refinement. You had time to embroider, so you carried delicate scissors. You wrote elegant letters, so you carried a seal. You had the resources to own beautiful silver accessories. For middle-class women like Margaret, a chatter was more practical. It was still decorative, still respectable, but the emphasis was on efficiency and household management. You needed scissors to deal with mending. You needed a pencil for household accounts. You needed a watch to keep the schedule running smoothly. And working-class women generally didn't wear chatterins at all. They were too expensive, too impractical for physical labor, too easy to damage or lose. Working women used their dress pockets when they had them, or they simply did without. The chat marked you as someone who didn't do heavy manual labor, someone whose work was domestic and gentile, rather than industrial and physical. There were also gendered implications. Men carried pocket watches, penknives, keys, but these items went in actual pockets in their coats and trousers. They were concealed. Men's practical tools were hidden, private. Accessing them was a discreet gesture. But women's tools hung openly at their waists, visible, decorative, part of their outfit. Even practicality had to be turned into ornamentation for women. Even tools had to be beautiful. And here's something that strikes me as particularly telling. The shatter hook that attached to your waistband was designed to be removable. You could take the whole thing off easily, but many women wore their shatter lens for most of their waking hours, only removing them for sleep or for very formal occasions where they might be considered too practical looking. They became part of your body, almost like wearing a belt or a piece of jewelry that you rarely took off. The weight of it, the slight pull at your waist, the soft clinking sound of the chains when you moved, these became familiar, normal, part of how it felt to be dressed and ready for the day. Margaret goes through her entire day with her shatten. At breakfast, she uses the pencil to make notes about needed groceries. Mid-morning, she uses the scissors to snip a loose thread on her son's jacket. When a friend visits and feels faint in the overheated parlor, Margaret opens her vinaigrette and waves it under her friend's nose, bringing her back around. In the afternoon, she uses her seal to close a letter to her sister. Each implement serves its purpose. Each chain holds exactly what's needed. By the end of the day, Margaret's waist is sore, where the shatter's weight has been pulling all day. She has a small bruise forming where the hook pressed against her thigh. Oh, the fabric. But she doesn't think of removing it or going without it. It's part of her daily uniform, part of how she presents herself as a capable, organized, respectable woman. The discomfort is just one more small price paid for meeting society's expectations. The shatter started to decline in the early 20th century, as women's fashion changed, as dresses began to have more functional pockets, as handbags became more acceptable and fashionable. The need for chatterins diminished. By the 1920s, they were largely obsolete, worn only by nurses and perhaps by older women who had never adapted to carrying handbags, but they left a legacy. They remind us that humans are remarkably adaptable. We can find solutions to absurd problems. We can create beauty and functionality. Even within restrictive systems, the shatter was a clever innovation, a genuinely useful device, but it was only necessary because everything else about Victorian women's clothing was so impractical that they needed a specialized tool belt just to carry scissors and pencils. Today, we carry smartphones that can do 1,000 things the Victorian chatelaine could never dream of. But in a way, the impulse is the same. The need to have essential tools always available, always within reach, always ready for whatever the day might bring. We've just miniaturized and digitized what Victorian women wore as chains and implements at their waists. And just like the shatter, our smartphones have become part of how we present ourselves. The case you choose, how you carry it, whether it's always in your hand or tucked away. These are all little signals about who you are and how you navigate the world. The technology changes, but the human need to feel prepared to have our essential tools nearby that remains constant across centuries. Margaret removes her shatter at the end of the day, sets it carefully on her dressing table where she can find it easily in the morning. The silver gleams in the gaslight. Each implement is exactly where it should be, ready for tomorrow's needs. She rubs the sore spot at her waist, where it hung all day, and she doesn't question whether wearing it is worth the discomfort. because in her world, in her time, a woman without her tools is unprepared, and being unprepared is unacceptable. Now we've explored the devices women wore, the tools they carried, the physical objects that shaped their daily lives. But there was another force controlling Victorian women's existence, one that was even more powerful than corsets or crinolines or chatelaines, because these physical devices only worked in conjunction with an elaborate system of social rules, unwritten laws about behavior, appearance, etiquette, what was proper and what was scandalous. And these rules, these expectations, they were enforced not by governments or police, but by other women, by social pressure, by the constant threat of being judged, criticized, ostracized for the smallest violation. So let's turn now to the invisible architecture of control. Let's explore the etiquette prison that dictated every moment of a Victorian woman's day. Because understanding the rules helps us see why the physical restrictions were so effective. Stay close. We're entering the realm of manners, morals, and the social machinery that made all of this possible. Imagine living in a world where wearing the wrong dress at the wrong time of day could ruin your reputation, where the angle at which you held your teacup communicated your breeding and character, where being seen fastening your own button suggested poverty and impropriety, where every gesture, every word, every moment of your day was governed by hundreds of unwritten rules that everyone somehow knew and everyone ruthlessly enforced. This was Victory, an etiquette, and it was the most powerful control mechanism of all. Because while you could theoretically take off a corset or refuse to wear a bustle, you couldn't escape the social rules. They were everywhere, they were invisible, and they were absolutely merciless. The thing about Victorian etiquette is that it wasn't just about manners, it was about power. It was about maintaining class boundaries. It was about controlling women's behavior and mobility. And it was about creating a system so complex, so arbitrary, so constantly shifting that you could never be entirely sure you were doing everything right. You were always one small mistake away from social disaster. Let me tell you about a day in the life of a woman trying to navigate this minefield. Her name is Sophia. It's 1882. Sophia is 25 years old, the daughter of a successful merchant. Her family is solidly middle class, comfortable, but not wealthy. And Sophia's entire future depends on making a good marriage, which means she needs to be seen as properly bred, well-mannered, and respectable. One serious social misstep could damage her reputation so badly that no decent man would consider courting her. Sophia wakes up at 7 in the morning. Her first decision of the day is what to wear. But this isn't a simple choice based on weather or personal preference. There are strict rules about dress codes for different times of day and different activities. For the morning, when Sophia will be at home with her family, she needs to wear what's called a morning dress. This is a relatively simple gown, high-necked, long-sleeved with minimal decoration. It announces that she's at home, that she's not expecting formal visitors, that this is private family time. If Sophia wore an afternoon dress at breakfast time, it would suggest she was putting on airs, that she thought herself too grand for simple family meals. If she or an evening gown before sunset, she'd look ridiculous, absurdly overdressed, and possibly morally questionable, because evening gowns had lower necklines that were only appropriate after dark. The time of day dictated the outfit. There was no flexibility, no personal choice based on what you felt like wearing. After breakfast, Sophia plans to go for a walk. This requires changing into a walking dress. Not just any dress, mind you, but specifically a walking dress. These were designed to be slightly shorter than regular day dresses, reaching only to the ankle rather than sweeping the ground, because they were meant to be worn outdoors where dragging hems would get muddy. Walking dresses were also made of sturdier fabrics that could withstand weather and wear. But here's where it gets complicated. If Sophia is just walking in her own garden, the morning dress would be acceptable. But if she's walking in public, on the street, or in the park, where she might encounter neighbors or acquaintances, She absolutely must change into the walking dress, and she must wear the appropriate accessories, a hat, gloves, and possibly a parasol if it's sunny. Being seen on the street improperly dressed would mark her as careless, lower-ass, or worse. Sophia walks through the park. She sees an acquaintance, another young woman she knows from church. Do they acknowledge each other? Well, that depends. If they've been formally introduced, if they're considered social equals, if they're both unchaperoned or both with appropriate companions, then yes, a polite nod or brief greeting is appropriate. But if there's any question about social standing, if one of them is with a male companion, if they haven't been properly introduced, then they must pretend not to see each other. Looking at someone you haven't been introduced to, especially if you're of different social classes, is forward, improp. It suggests a lack of breeding. The rules about introductions were elaborate and rigid. You couldn't just walk up to someone and introduce yourself. That would be pushy, vulgar, American, which was Victorian shorthand for lacking proper manners. Instead, you needed a mutual acquaintance to perform the introduction. And even then, there was a hierarchy. A younger person was introduced to an older person. A person of lower social standing was introduced to someone of higher standing. A man was introduced to a woman, not the other way around. And here's the thing. You had to remember everyone you'd been introduced to, every single person, because if you encountered them again and didn't acknowledge them, you'd be giving offense. But if you acknowledged someone you'd never been properly introduced to, you'd be presumptuous. The social memory required was extraordinary. Sophia returns home and changes again back into her morning dress because she's back in the private sphere. An hour later, a visitor arrives. This is a formal morning call, which, despite the name, takes place in the afternoon between 2 and 5. That's when ladies were expected to be at home receiving visitors. Sophia must change again, this time into an afternoon dress. This is more elaborate than the morning dress, but still respectable and modest, with a higher neckline and longer sleeves than evening wear. The visitor is a married woman, a friend of Sophia's mother. She's come to pay a call, which is a ritualized social visit with very specific rules. The visit should last exactly 15 to 20 minutes, not 10 minutes, that's too brief, and suggest you don't value the relationship. Not 30 minutes, that's overstaying, and suggest you don't understand proper boundaries. 15 to 20 minutes precisely. During the call, tea is served, and now Sophia must navigate the complex etiquette of tea drinking. How she holds her teacup, how she sits, how she makes conversation, all of this is being observed and judged. She must sit with perfect posture, back straight, because the corset prevents slouching anyway. She must hold the teacup by the handle, never cradling the bowl in her hands. She must sip quietly, never slurp. She must eat any offered cake or cookies with a fork, never her fingers, even if they're bite-sized. And the conversation that's governed by rules, too. She must not speak unless spoken to, since she's younger and unmarried. When she does speak, she must discuss only appropriate topics. The weather, local charity work, perhaps a recent concert or lecture. She absolutely must not discuss politics, religion, money, health problems, or anything remotely controversial. Those topics are vulgar, inappropriate for ladies. She must appear interested, but not too knowledgeable, because excessive learning in women was considered unfeminine and threatening. The visitor leaves after exactly 18 minutes. Sophia has passed this test. The call went well. Her mother is pleased. Sophia's manners reflected well on the family. But the day isn't over. Tonight there's a dinner party. And dinner parties were the Olympics of Victorian etiquette. Sophia must change once more into an evening gown. This is the most formal, most elaborate outfit. Lower neckline, bare shoulders, rich fabrics, elaborate decoration. But there are rules here, too. An unmarried young woman shouldn't wear a neckline that's too low, white or pale. Colors are most appropriate for young ladies. Dark colors like black, burgundy, or deep purple are for married women or older ladies. Sophia chooses a pale lavender gown with modest decoration, safe, respectable, age-appropriate, At the dinner party, the rules multiply exponentially. Sophia must be escorted into the dining room by a gentleman, but not just any gentleman. There's an order of precedence. The hostess determines who escorts whom based on social rank, age, and relationship status. Sophia is paired with a young man of similar age and standing. They walk in together, but not arm in arm. That's too intimate. He offers his arm. She rests her hand lightly on it, and they proceed with appropriate distance between their bodies. At the table, Sophia must navigate a bewildering array of rules. Which fork to use for which course, how to place her napkin, when to begin eating only after the hostess begins, how to cut her food, small pieces only, never large bites, how to rest her utensils between bites, how to signal she's finished, placing knife and fork parallel across the plate at a specific angle. Every gesture has meaning, every movement is codified, and the conversation at dinner even more restricted. Sophia must speak to the gentleman on her right during the first course, then turn to the gentleman on her left for the next course, alternating throughout the meal. This is called turning the table, and it's mandatory. You can't just speak to whoever you find most interesting. That would be rude to the other person. You must divide your attention equally, regardless of whether you find your dinner partners boring or delightful. The topics of conversation are still restricted, but there's an added layer. Sophia must be charming without being forward, interesting without being too clever, engaging without being flirtatious. She must laugh at jokes but not too loudly. She must ask questions but not seem nosy. She must express opinions but always defer to male authority. It's an exhausting performance. And here's what's truly insidious about all of this. These rules weren't written down anywhere official. There was no government handbook of Victorian etiquette. Instead, there were dozens of privately published etiquette books, all slightly different, all claiming to represent proper behavior, and all subtly contradicting each other on small points. You could read 3 different etiquette manuals and get 3 different answers about whether it was acceptable to eat asparagus with your fingers or whether you absolutely must use a fork. This ambiguity was part of the system. It meant that you could never be entirely sure you were doing things right. It meant that someone from a higher social class could always find fault with your manners, could always point out some tiny violation you didn't even know was a violation. It created constant anxiety, constant vigilance, constant fear of making a mistake. And the consequences of mistakes, they could be devastating. If you committed a serious breach of etiquette, if you wore the wrong thing, or said the wrong thing, or behaved inappropriately at an important event, word would spread. Victorian society was intensely gossipy. Women would discuss it at their morning calls. Men would mention it at their clubs. Within days, everyone in your social circle would know. Your reputation would be damaged. Mothers would warn their sons away from you. Other young women would distance themselves to avoid guilt by association. For women like Sophia, whose entire future depended on making a good marriage, this was a real and constant threat. One mistake could ruin everything. So you followed the rules even when they were arbitrary, even when they were uncomfortable, even when they were exhausting, because the alternative was social death. Let me tell you about a real case that illustrates just how harsh these social judgments could be. In the 1860s, there was a young woman in London society, I'll call her Miss A, to protect her identity even now, who attended a ball and accidentally wore a dress that was considered too elaborate for an unmarried woman. The dress itself was beautiful, expensive, fashionable, but it was in a style that was more appropriate for a married woman. The neckline was perhaps an inch lower than it should have been. The fabric was perhaps too rich, the decoration perhaps too lavish. Within a week, Missa found that invitation stopped arriving. Other young women no longer called on her. When she attended church, people looked away rather than greeting her. Why? Because the dress had suggested that she was putting on airs, that she was trying to appear more important or mature than her actual status warranted, or worse, that she was trying to attract male attention inappropriately. The dress became evidence of bad character, poor judgment, possibly even loose morals. Miss A's mother wrote desperate letters to friends explaining it was an innocent mistake, that her daughter meant no harm, but the damage was done. Miss A's marriage prospects were severely diminished. She eventually married, but to a man significantly below her family's social standing, because no gentleman of their own class would consider her after the dress scandal. One dress, one evening, her entire future altered. That's the power of social rules. They didn't need legal enforcement. The threat of social ostracism was enough. And it wasn't just about dress and dinner etiquette. There were rules about everything. How you walked, ladies glided, they didn't stride. How you laughed quietly, delicately, never full-throated gores. How you expressed emotion, restrained, controlled, never dramatic or excessive. How you occupied space, taking up as little room as possible, making yourself small and unobtrusive. There were rules about when you could go out. Unmarried women couldn't walk unchaperoned in public after dark. They couldn't attend the theater or concerts alone. They couldn't travel alone. They certainly couldn't go to restaurants or hotels alone. A WOM. And alone in public was immediately suspect. Possibly a prostitute. Definitely not respectable. There were rules about correspondence. You couldn't write to a man you weren't related to without a proper reason. Love letters were absolutely scandalous if discovered. Even business correspondence had to be carefully worded to avoid any hint of impropriety, and all letters had to be sealed with your personal seal, the one from your shutting, to prove they hadn't been tampered with. There were rules about reading. Certain books were considered inappropriate for ladies, novels with romantic content, books about politics or economics, scientific texts. Anything too intellectual or stimulating was thought to be dangerous for the delicate female mind. Women who read too much or too widely were considered blue stockings, which was an insult suggesting they were unfeminine, unmarriageable, unnatural. The rules varied slightly by class, too, which added another layer of complexity. Upper-class women had slightly different etiquette than middle-class women. What was acceptable for a duchess might be forward for a merchant's daughter. You had to know not just the rules, but which version of the rules applied to your specific social position, and fashion rules changed constantly. What was proper one year might be outdated the next. Hemlines rose and fell, necklines varied, sleeve styles changed, the fashionable silhouette evolved. Keeping up required constant attention to fashion magazines, careful observation of what society leaders were wearing, significant financial investment in new clothing. Falling behind in fashion was a social failing. It suggested poverty, lack of attention, insufficient care about your appearance, and therefore your character. Sophia makes it through the dinner party without committing any breaches. She's worn the right dress, used the right fork, made appropriate conversation, and demonstrated proper manners throughout. When she gets home, she's exhausted, not just physically, though the corset and the heavy gown and the hours of maintaining perfect posture have taken their toll, but mentally, emotionally exhausted. The constant vigilance, the unending performance, the anxiety of potentially making a mistake. It's draining in a way that's hard to explain to anyone who hasn't experienced it. She thinks about how much simpler life must be for men. Men have rules too, certainly, but their rules are fewer, more straightforward, more forgiving. A man who makes a social mistake is eccentric. A woman who makes the same mistake is ruined. Men can travel alone, can go to clubs, can speak freely on controversial topics, can wear basically the same outfit for most occasions with minor variations. Their lives aren't a constant minefield of potential etiquette violations. Sophia wonders not for the first time what it would be like to live without these rules, to wear what felt comfortable, to speak freely, to move through the world without constant anxiety about whether she's doing everything correctly. But she can't imagine it. Not really. because the rules aren't just external. By now, after 25 years of training, they're internal. They're part of how she thinks, part of who she is. The cages become invisible because she's never known anything else. That's the ultimate success of the etiquette system. It doesn't just control behavior. It shapes identity. It makes women internalize the restrictions until they seem natural, necessary, even desirable, until women themselves become the enforcers, judging other women, teaching their daughters the same rules, maintaining the system that restricts them. The beauty of Victorian etiquette as a control mechanism was its efficiency. It required no police force, no legal system, no overt violence, just the threat of social disapproval, just the fear of being talked about, gossiped about, judged, excluded. And that threat was powerful enough to make millions of women voluntarily restrict their own lives in countless ways. We've explored how physical devices controlled women's bodies, how social rules control their behavior. But there's one more dimension we need to examine, because maintaining all of these standards, meeting all of these requirements, it required enormous amounts of time. Time spent on beauty, rituals, on fashion, on the elaborate processes of presenting an acceptable face to the world. And that time investment was itself a form of control. When you spend 3 to 4 hours every day just on your appearance, you don't have time or energy for much else. So let's turn now to the beauty rituals that consumed Victorian women's days, the elaborate routines, the time-intensive processes, the never-ending pursuit of the perfect complexion and perfectly styled hair, because understanding how much time this required helps us see the final piece of the puzzle. Stay with me. We're almost at the end of this journey through Victorian women's daily lives. How much time do you spend on your appearance each day? Maybe 30 minutes in the morning, an hour if you're really putting effort in. Perhaps you spend an extra hour or two once a week doing your nails, a face, mask, something special. Most of us spend maybe an hour a day tops on grooming and beauty. That leaves 23 hours for everything else, for work, for relationships, for hobbies, for rest, for living. Now imagine if your beauty routine took 3 to 4 hours every single day. Not optional hours, not luxury, pampering time, but mandatory necessary hours just to achieve the baseline of acceptable appearance. Hours that if you didn't invest them, you'd be considered unkempt, improper, possibly immoral. What would you have time for then? What would be left of your day after those hours were consumed? This was the reality for Victorian women, and it was perhaps the most effective control mechanism of all, because time is the one resource you can't make more of. When your beauty routine consumes hours every day, you don't have those hours for anything else. Not for education, not for creative work, not for political organizing, not for anything that might challenge the system that keeps you occupied with your appearance. Let me walk you through a Victorian woman's beauty routine. Her name is Constance. It's 1890 and she's 32 years old, married with 2 children. She's solidly middle class, and every morning she wakes up knowing that before she can do anything else, before she can eat breakfast or see her children or begin her day, she needs to spend at least an hour and a half on her appearance, sometimes 2 hours if her hair is being particularly difficult. Constance's day begins at 6:30 in the morning, but she doesn't get out of bed immediately. First, she performs what's called her morning toilet. While still in her night clothes, she sits up in bed and begins with her hair. Victorian women were supposed to brush their hair 100 strokes every night before bed, but most women also gave it a good brushing in the morning. This wasn't just vanity. Victorian hair care practices meant that hair was rarely washed, maybe once a month or even less frequently, because the soaps were harsh and drying. So brushing was essential for distributing the natural oils from scalp to ends, for removing tangles, for keeping the hair manageable. 100 strokes takes about 10 to 15 minutes, if you're doing it properly. Long, slow strokes from root to tip. Constance has hair that reaches past her waist. It's heavy. It takes effort. Her arm gets tired. But this is non-negotiable. Well-maintained hair is a sign of R2, of cleanliness, of proper feminine care. Neglecting your hair suggests neglecting your character. After brushing, Constance braids her hair loosely to keep it contained while she washes. She rings for her lady's maid, who brings a basin of warm water, a cloth, and a small bowl of cold cream. Victorian women didn't typically take full baths every day. Daily bathing wasn't common until quite late in the Victorian era, partly because most homes didn't have indoor plumbing, and partly because frequent bathing was thought to be unhealthy, too shocking to the system. Instead, women performed what was called a sponge bath, using the cloth and warm water. Constance washes her face, neck, arms, and torso. This takes about 15 minutes. She's thorough but efficient. Then comes the cold cream. This is a mixture of beeswax, almond oil, and rose water, and it's the Victorian woman's primary skincare product. Constance massages it into her face and neck, working it into her skin to moisturize and protect. The cold cream also serves as a makeup remover if she wore any the day before, though respectable women didn't wear obvious makeup. So this is mostly just skincare. Already we're 45 minutes into the morning, and Constance hasn't even gotten dressed yet. She hasn't touched her hair. Beyond the preliminary brushing, she's barely awake, and the most time-consuming parts are still ahead. Now comes the hairstyling. Constance's maid helps her with this because the fashionable hairstyles of the 1890s are complex and impossible to achieve alone. The current fashion requires hair to be swept up and arranged in elaborate waves and puffs on top of the head, with perhaps some curled tendrils framing the face. To achieve this, Constance's hair must be sectioned, each section carefully arranged, and the whole structure secured with countless hair pins. First, the maid creates a base using a rat, which is a padded form made from collected hair. Yes, often hair that's fallen out during brushing and been saved, or from hair purchased from poorer women. This rat is pinned to the top of Constance's head, creating volume and structure. Then Constance's own hair is brushed over and around it section by section, each piece carefully positioned and secured with pins. Lots of pins, sometimes 30 or 40 pins to hold everything in place. Some sections need to be curled first. Remember the curling tongs we discussed? Those come out now. The maid heats them over the small spirit lamp on the dressing table and carefully curls selected sections of hair, wrapping them around the hot metal, holding them for a count of 20, releasing them to create perfect ringlets that will frame Constance's face. This entire hairstyling process takes 45 minutes. On a good day, if a section doesn't curl properly, if a pin slips and a whole section has to be redone, it can take an hour or more. And remember, Constance has been doing this since she was a teenager. She's had almost 20 years of practice. For a young woman just learning to style her hair in the current fashion, it could take even longer. Think about that time. Investment. 45 minutes to an hour every single morning just on hair. What could you do with that time if you had it back? You could read a book, learn a language, write, create something, think, rest. But Victorian women didn't have that choice. Their hair had to be properly done every day without exception, because appearing with unstyled hair was as unthinkable as appearing without a dress. Now Constance is finally ready to get dressed. We've already covered the dressing process, the layers and lacings and time involved, so I won't repeat all that, but add another 45 minutes for getting into all the undergarments and outer clothing with the maid's help. We're now at 2 hours and 15 minutes, and Constance still hasn't had breakfast. She's been awake since 6:30. It's now 8:45, and she's just barely achieved the baseline of acceptable appearance for the day. But the beauty routine doesn't end there. Throughout the day, Constance will need to monitor and adjust her appearance. The hairpins will loosen. Stray hairs will escape. The elaborate updo will start to sag. By afternoon, she'll need to spend another 15 to 20 minutes refreshing her hair, adding more pins, repositioning sections that have slipped. If she's going out in the evening, if there's a dinner or a concert or any social event, She'll need to redo her hair entirely because day hair and evening hair are different styles, and wearing the wrong one at the wrong time would be a social error. And then there are the special treatments, the extra routines that happen less frequently but still consume enormous amounts of time. Let's talk about hair washing since we mentioned it earlier. Constance washes her hair about once a month, maybe once every 3 weeks in summer when it gets oilier. And washing hair that reaches past your waist in an era before running water and hairdryers is an all-day affair. First, water has to be heated. Multiple large pots of water because you need enough to fully saturate and rinse all that hair. Then Constance leans over a basin, and her maid pours water over her hair section by section, works in the harsh soap, scrubs the scalp thoroughly, rinses and rinses and rinses some more to get all the soap out. This takes at least 30 minutes of active washing time, but then comes the drying. Constance can't just towel dry and go about her day. Her hair is thick, heavy, and saturated with water. It will take hours to dry naturally, so she sits near the fireplace or by a sunny window, combing her hair repeatedly to prevent tangles while it dries. This takes 3 to 4 hours. 3 to 4 hours just sitting there waiting for hair to dry, combing it periodically. An entire afternoon essentially lost to hair maintenance. Some women used various powders and dry shampoos between washings to absorb oil and keep hair fresh. These were made from things like orris root powder or cornstarch worked into the scalp and then brushed out. This helped extend the time between washings but was itself time-consuming, adding another 15 minutes to the daily routine and facial care. We touched on this briefly before, but let me give you more detail about the time investment. Victorian beauty manuals are full of recipes for homemade face masks and treatments, cucumbers mashed with honey, egg whites beaten and applied to the skin, oatmeal mixed with milk and rose water. These treatments were applied, left on for 30 minutes to an hour while you sat very still trying not to crack the mask, then carefully washed off. Women who took their complexion seriously might do one of these treatments 2 or 3 times a week, add another hour each time. And remember, you couldn't do anything else while wearing a face mask. You couldn't read easily because you had to keep your face still. You couldn't do needlework or write letters. You just had to sit there waiting for the mask to do its work. More time consumed, more hours of the day dedicated solely to appearance. Then there were the hand and nail care routines. Victorian ladies were supposed to have soft white hands. This was a class marker, proof that you didn't do manual labor, so there were elaborate routines for hand care. You wore gloves filled with cold cream at night. While you slept, you soaked your hands in various solutions. Lemon juice to lighten the skin, milk to soften, rose water to refine. You used pumice stones to remove any rough patches. You buffed your nails to a shine using shamrock cloths and various powders. Tea. His hand. Care didn't happen every day, but it was a regular part of the weekly routine. Maybe an hour once or twice a week dedicated just to hands. Because if your hands looked rough or work-worn, it suggested you were lower-ass, that you did your own housework, that you weren't a true lady. Do you see the pattern here? Every aspect of acceptable feminine appearance required time, significant regular investments of time, and it all added. If we calculate Constance's weekly time investment in beauty and appearance, it looks something like this. Daily hair brushing and styling, 1 hour per day, 7 hours per week. Daily washing and cold cream application, 20 minutes per day, about 2.5 hours per week. Getting dressed with assistance, 45 minutes morning and night, about 11 hours per week, just for dressing and undressing. Hair refreshing, midday 15 minutes, almost 2 hours per week. Special treatments like face masks, 3 hours per week. Hand care, 2 hours per week. Monthly hair washing, 4 hours once per month, about 1 hour per week when averaged out. That's about 28 to 30 hours per week. 30 hours. That's almost equivalent to a full-time job. Constance is spending the same amount of time on her appearance that many people spend on their entire careers. And this is mandatory. This is the baseline. This is what's required just to be considered properly groomed and respectable. Now, think about what Constance doesn't have time for because of this. She can't pursue serious education. Even if she wanted to study mathematics or philosophy or science, when would she do it? Between the hours spent on beauty, maintenance, and the hours spent on household management, and the hours spent on obligatory social calls, and the hours spent on needlework and other expected feminine accomplishments, there's barely any time left for reading, let alone serious study. She can't develop a career or a business. Even if Victorian society was more accepting of women working, which it wasn't, she wouldn't have time. The beauty requirements alone would make it nearly impossible to hold down a job that required her to be somewhere at a specific time looking specific way. She can't engage in serious political or social activism. Some women did, of course. The suffrage movement existed. Women fought for their rights. But think about the additional barriers they faced. They had to maintain proper appearance, which took hours every day, and then find time for activism on top of all their other obligations. It's exhausting just thinking about it. The time investment in beauty maintenance was itself a form of oppression. It kept women occupied with themselves, with their appearance, with the small acceptable concerns of fashion and grooming. It left little time or energy for anything that might challenge the system. And here's the truly brilliant part. It was presented as self-care, as something women did for themselves. Victorian beauty manuals emphasized that taking care of your appearance was a form of self-respect, of self-love, of proper feminine virtue. You weren't spending 3 hours a day on beauty maintenance because society demanded it. You were doing it because you valued yourself, because you wanted to present your best self to the world, because proper grooming was part of being a refined, civilized woman. This reframing made the time investment seem voluntary, even desirable. Women weren't being controlled. They were choosing to invest in their appearance. Except, of course, they weren't really choosing. Because a woman who didn't invest this time, who appeared with unstyled hair or an unkempt complexion or rough hands, would face immediate social consequences. She'd be judged as lazy, lower-ass, possibly immoral. So, the choice was really no choice at all. There's a poignant passage in a Victorian woman's diary from the 1880s. She writes, "Spent the morning on my hair and toilet. By the time I was properly dressed, it was time for luncheon. After luncheon, I received calls. Then I had to change for dinner. After dinner, I was so exhausted I could barely read. I had wanted to study Italian, but there are never enough hours in the day. I wonder sometimes what I might accomplish if I did not have to spend so much time simply looking presentable." She's articulating exactly what the system was designed to do. Consume her time and energy so completely that she had nothing left for pursuits that might expand her mind or her influence. The beauty routine wasn't just about appearance. It was about control through time consumption. And it worked for decades, for generations. It worked beautifully. Victorian women spent enormous portions of their lives engaged in elaborate grooming rituals, maintaining appearances that required constant attention and upkeep, following fashion, rules that changed regularly and required new investments of time and money to stay current. And while they were busy with all of that, they weren't organizing labor movements or demanding voting rights or challenging the fundamental structures of power. Some women did, of course, the brave ones, the determined ones, the ones who somehow found the energy to fight despite all the barriers. But think about how much more they could have accomplished if they hadn't been starting from a place of such deep exhaustion. Constance ends her day as she began it, with her appearance. At night, her maid helps her undress, which takes another 30 minutes. Then Constance sits at her dressing table and brushes her hair. 100 strokes again every night. She applies cold cream to her face. She perhaps puts on gloves filled with moisturizing cream for her hands. These nighttime rituals take another 30 minutes. By the time she climbs into bed, she spent over 3 hours total on her appearance throughout the day. 3 hours that she will never get back. 3 hours that could have been spent reading, thinking, creating, resting, living. But those hours are gone, consumed by the endless requirements of Victorian beauty standards, and she'll do it all again when she wakes up, and the day after that, the day after that for the rest of her life. Because being a proper Victorian woman means dedicating a significant portion of your existence to the maintenance of an appearance that meets ever-changing, arbitrarily enforced standards of feminine beauty. That's the final piece of the puzzle. The corsets restricted movement, the layers created dependence, the social rules controlled behavior, and the beauty rituals consumed time. Together, these mechanisms created a comprehensive system of control that shaped every aspect of Victorian women's lives. But systems like this don't last forever. Eventually, women started pushing back, demanding change, fighting for the right to dress comfortably, to move freely, to spend their time on things other than beauty maintenance. The story of how Victorian fashion and restrictions finally began to break down is fascinating, complex, and ultimately hopeful. So stay with me. We've covered the devices, the rules, the rituals. Now, let's explore how women began to resist, how reform movements emerged, how the slow liberation from these restrictions finally began. Because understanding how these systems fell apart helps us recognize the power of resistance, the importance of questioning arbitrary rules, and the value of fighting for freedom, even when the odds seem impossible. Let's continue this journey together. There comes a moment in every oppressive system when someone finally says enough. When someone looks at the rules, everyone else follows without question and asks why. When someone dares to imagine that things could be different. And in Victorian England, that moment came not from men, not from legislators, or doctors, or fashion designers, but from women themselves. Women who are tired of corsets, tired of bustles, tired of spending hours on their appearance, tired of rules that made no sense, tired of being decorative, rather than unfunctional, tired of being controlled. The rebellion didn't happen overnight. It didn't happen with dramatic revolution. Instead, it was slow, incremental, contested at every step. But it happened. And the story of how Victorian women began to push back against the devices and rules that controlled them is one of the most inspiring chapters in the history of women's rights. Let me introduce you to someone who was part of this movement. Her name is Ada. It's 1884, and Ada is 29 years old. She's unmarried, which is itself somewhat unusual for her age, and she's educated, having attended one of the new women's colleges that have started appearing in England. Ada has read extensively. She's thought deeply about women's position in society, and she's come to a conclusion that many of her contemporaries would find shocking. The restrictions on women's clothing are not just uncomfortable, they're actively harmful, and they need to change. Ada becomes involved with something called the Rational Dress Society, founded in 1881 by Vacantis Harbetten. This organization had a radical mission to promote clothing for women that was comfortable, healthy, and practical. They published a manifesto declaring that women's dress should not exceed 7 lb in weight and that all undergarments should hang from the shoulders rather than the waist, distributing weight more evenly and taking pressure off the internal organs. 7 lb. Remember, we've talked about women's clothing weighing 15 to 20 lb. The Rational Dress Society was proposing cutting that weight by more than half. This was revolutionary. This was dangerous in the eyes of many because it threatened the entire system. The society held meetings, they published pamphlets, they gave lectures, and they promoted specific clothing alternatives. One was called the emancipation waist, a soft, flexible corset-like garment made of breathable fleek. Y material without rigid bond. It was designed to provide gentle support without constriction. Another was divided skirts, essentially very wide trousers that looked like a skirt when you were standing still but allowed much freer movement than Traditional skirts, can you imagine how shocking this was? Women suggesting that other women should wear something resembling trousers. In the 1880s, this was scandalous. It was masculine. It was improper. It threatened the very foundations of gender distinction. If women dressed like men, what would happen to society? The pushback was immediate and fierce. Fashion magazines published articles condemning rational dress as ugly and unfeminine. Doctors, many of them male, published papers arguing that traditional corsets were actually necessary for women's health, that women's muscles were too weak to support their own torsos without stays. Satirical cartoons in Punch magazine mocked rational dress advocates, drawing them as mananish, unattractive women who couldn't find husbands. The message was clear. If you want to be attractive to men, if you want to be accepted in polite society, you'll wear traditional clothing. You'll suffer through the corset. You'll spend hours on your appearance. You will follow the rules. The rational dress advocates were portrayed as unfeminine malcontents who were angry about their own lack of appeal and wanted to drag all women down to their level. But some women listened. Some women tried the alternatives, and here's what they found. It felt amazing. Being able to breathe deeply, being able to move freely, wearing clothing that didn't weigh them down. Once you experienced that freedom, it was almost impossible to go back willingly. Ada attends a meeting of the Rational Dress Society in London. She listens to other women share their experiences. One woman talks about how wearing an emancipation waist instead of a traditional corset has eliminated her chronic headaches and digestive problems. Another describes being able to ride a bicycle for the first time, feeling the wind in her face, the exhilaration of speed and movement. A third woman, a factory worker, talks about how divided skirts allow her to work more efficiently and safely without her long skirts getting caught in machinery. These testimonials are powerful. They're personal. They're evidence that the restrictions aren't necessary, that women can function, can thrive, can be healthy and happy in more practical clothing. Ada feels something she's never felt before. Hope that change is possible. Hope that she might live to see a day when women are judged by their character and abilities rather than by whether their waist measures 22 in. But rational dress never becomes mainstream during the Victorian era. Why? Because the opposition is too strong. Because the social pressure is too intense. Because most women, even women who privately agree that corsets are uncomfortable and impractical, won't risk the social consequences of defying fashion. Being labeled as a rational dress advocate could damage your reputation, hurt your marriage prospects, make you a target of ridicule. For most women, it's not worth the risk. What does succeed, though, is a gradual softening of standards. By the 1890s, extreme tight lacing is falling out of fashion. Corsets become slightly less restrictive, though still mandatory. The shelf bustle disappears, replaced by softer, more natural silhouettes. Skirts become slightly shorter, reaching only to the ankle rather than dragging on the ground. These changes are subtle. No single change is dramatic enough to be revolutionary, but collectively they represent a slow movement toward more practical clothing. And then comes the biggest catalyst for change: bicycles. The bicycle, K.A. Z of the 1890s changes everything. Suddenly there's an activity that middle-class women want to participate in, an activity that's socially acceptable, even fashionable. But you absolutely cannot ride a bicycle in a traditional Victorian outfit. The long skirts get caught in the wheels and chain. The corset prevents you from bending forward properly. The bustle makes sitting on the bicycle seat impossible. So women who want to cycle have to innovate. They start wearing specialized cycling costumes, shorter skirts, sometimes divided skirts that resemble bloomers, looser bodices that allow for arm movement and breathing. And when men see women cycling, see them exercising, see them moving freely and enjoying themselves, it becomes harder to argue that women need restrictive clothing for their health and safety. Sports in general become an unexpected avenue for dress reform. Tennis is becoming popular among the upper and middle classes. Women want to play, but You can't play tennis in a corset and bustle ensemble. So tennis dresses emerge, still modest and respectable by Victorian standards, but significantly more practical than everyday wear. They have slightly shorter skirts, less structured bodices, and are made of lighter fabrics that allow for movement. By the late 1890s, more and more women are working outside the home. The statistics are striking. In 1890, about 3.7 million women in the United States are employed in jobs outside of domestic service. By 1900, that number has jumped to over 5 million. These working women, secretaries, shop girls, teachers, nurses, they need practical clothing. They can't spend 3 hours a day on beauty maintenance. They can't wear 15 pounds of fabric to work. So gradually, working women's fashion becomes simpler, more functional, more rational. And here's where World War I becomes a crucial turning point, though we're now moving beyond the Victorian era proper into the Edwardian period and beyond. When the war begins in 1914, men leave for the front by the millions and women step into their jobs. Women work in munitions factories, in offices, in transportation, in agriculture, and they simply cannot do this work in traditional restrictive clothing. Necessity drives change faster than any reform movement ever could. Corsets become shorter, less restrictive, designed to allow for physical labor. Skirts become even shorter, rising above the ankle, sometimes to mid-calf. Women start wearing something unthinkable just a decade earlier. They wear trousers, actual trousers, for work, and the sky doesn't fall. Society doesn't collapse. Instead, productivity increases. Women prove they can do the work that men have been doing, and in the process they prove that they don't need restrictive clothing. By the 1920s, the transformation is remarkable. The flapper style emerges, loose straight dresses that don't require corsets, short hair that doesn't need hours of styling every day, hemlines that rise to the knee, women dancing, smoking, working, voting, living lives that would have been unimaginable to Victorian women just 30 years earlier. But let's not romanticize too much. The restrictions didn't disappear. They just changed form. Women in the 1920s faced new beauty pressures. The pressure to be thin, since the new fashions didn't hide body shape like Victorian layers did. The pressure to look young, to bob their hair, to wear makeup in the right way. Fashion became less physically restricting, but arguably more psychologically demanding in some ways. And today, well, we like to think we've moved beyond all of that. We can wear whatever we want, right? We have choices, freedom. But do we really? How many women still spend hours every day on their appearance? How many still feel pressured to meet beauty standards that are arbitrary and constantly changing? How many still wear uncomfortable shoes because they're fashionable? How many still diet obsessively, alter their bodies with surgery, spend their money and time and mental energy on achieving an appearance that meets social approval? The specific restrictions have changed. We don't wear corsets, thank goodness, but we have shapewear, which is essentially modern corsetry. We don't spend hours arranging our hair over rats, but we spend comparable time with straighteners, curlers, extensions, dyes, treatments. We don't worry about our hands looking too work-worn, but we worry about our bodies being the wrong shape, our faces showing signs of aging, our overall appearance not measuring up to heavily edited images we see constantly on social media. The Victorian devices are gone. But the underlying dynamic, the idea that women's value is tied to their appearance, that achieving the right look requires significant investment of time and money and discomfort, that social and economic opportunities depend on meeting beauty standards, that's still with us. It's just taken new forms. What can we learn from Victorian women's experiences? What does their story teach us about our own time? I think there are several important lessons. First, that systems of control often present themselves as natural, necessary, inevitable. Victorian women were told that corsets were essential for their health, that they couldn't possibly support their own bodies without them. This was presented as biological fact, as medical necessity, but it was never true. It was social control masquerading as scientific wisdom. When we're told today that certain beauty practices are necessary, that we need to look a certain way to be professional or attractive or successful, we should ask necessary, according to who benefits from these standards. Second, that small resistances matter. The rational dress advocates didn't revolutionize Victorian fashion overnight, but they started conversations. They planted seeds. They showed that alternatives were possible. Every woman who dared to wear a slightly looser corset, to skip a beauty treatment, to question whether the rules made sense, she was part of a larger movement toward freedom. Our small resistances today matter too. Every time we question beauty standards, refuse to participate in some oppressive practice, support other women's choices, we're contributing to change. Third, that systems don't change until they're challenged. Victorian fashion restrictions lasted as long as they did, because most women accepted them as inevitable. Change came when enough women started saying no, when they organized, when they created alternatives, when they refused to accept that discomfort was the necessary price of femininity. If we want things to be different today, we have to be willing to challenge the systems that constrain us, even when that's uncomfortable, even when we face pushback. And finally, that freedom is worth fighting for. The Victorian women who advocated for rational dress faced ridicule, social ostracism, accusations of being unfeminine and unattractive. But they fought anyway because being able to breathe deeply, to move freely, to spend their time on things other than beauty maintenance, that was worth the cost. The freedoms we have today, the ability to wear comfortable clothing, to move through the world without being physically restricted, we owe that to the women who fought for change, even when it seemed impossible. Ada continues. Her work with the Rational Dress Society for years, she never sees the dramatic changes she hopes for during her lifetime. She dies in 1912, still wearing a slightly more practical version of Victorian clothing, but never achieving the full freedom she envisioned. But she lived to see bicycles become commonplace, to see women working outside the home in increasing numbers, to see the first cracks in the system she challenged. She never knew about flappers or women's suffrage or the revolution that would come just a few years after her death, but she helped make it possible. That's the thing about fighting for change. You might not see the victory yourself, but you're part of a longer arc of progress. You're contributing to a movement that's bigger than any individual. Ada and the women, like her, they're part of our story. They fought so that we could have choices they never had. We've journeyed through the devices, the rules, the rituals that controlled Victorian women's daily lives. We've seen how comprehensively women were restricted from their first breath in the morning until they closed their eyes at night. We've explored the physical, social, and temporal mechanisms of control, and we've seen the beginning of resistance, the slow movement toward freedom. But there's one final question we need to address. What does all of this mean for us? How do we take these lessons from Victorian history and apply them to our own lives? How do we recognize the modern devices that still control us? And how do we move forward with wisdom, awareness, and determination to create a world where no one is constrained by arbitrary rules about how they should look or move or spend their time? Stay with me. We're almost at the end. Let's bring this journey home together. We've spent this long night together, exploring a world that seems distant, almost unrecognizable. A world where women couldn't breathe deeply, couldn't sit comfortably, couldn't move freely through space. Ah, world where getting dressed required another person's help and took over an hour. A world where beauty maintenance consumed 30 hours a week. A world where social rules dictated every gesture, every word, every moment of public existence. A world where devices, visible and invisible, controlled women's bodies, their time, their very possibilities. It's easy to look back at Victorian women and feel pity or relief that we don't live in that time, or even a kind of smug superiority, thinking how much more enlightened we are now. But I want us to sit with something more uncomfortable. I want us to ask, how far have we really come? And what devices, what rules, what mechanisms still control us today? Because here's the truth. The corset is gone, but we have other things. Shapewear that promises to smooth and slim, that we squeeze ourselves into for special occasions, that leaves marks on our skin and restricts our breathing just a little bit. High heels that throw off our posture, that damage our feet and ankles, that make it nearly impossible to run if we need to, but that we wear anyway because they're professional, because they're sexy, because flat shoes would be too casual for this meeting or that event. The crinoline is gone, but we have other expectations, the perfect body shape that changes with fashion, just like Victorian silhouettes did. In the 80s, it was athletic and toned. In the 9 seconds, it was waif-thin. In the 2000s, it was curves in specific places, but flat stomach. In the 2010s, it was impossible proportions achieved through cosmetic surgery. The specific, ideal changes, but the underlying message remains. Your natural body is not acceptable. You must shape it, constrain it, alter it to meet current standards. The hours Victorian women spent on hairstyling we spend on different beauty practices, makeup routines that can take an hour or more, skincare regimens with 10 steps, hair removal that's expensive, time-consuming, sometimes painful, nail appointments, lash extensions, eyebrow microlading, all the more procedures and practices that add up to hours and hours and significant amounts of money, all to achieve a look that's considered baseline acceptable in professional or social settings. And the etiquette, rules, they've evolved, but they haven't disappeared. We have dress codes, spoken and unspoken. We have ideas about what's appropriate for work versus casual versus formal events. We have judgments about women who wear too much makeup or not enough, who dress too provocatively or too frumpy, who show signs of aging, or who look overdone from trying to hide those signs. We have the modern version of calling, cards and morning visits, social media presence, carefully curated images, the performance of having a perfect life that must be maintained at all times. The specific mechanisms have changed, but the underlying dynamic, women's value being tied to appearance, women being judged primarily on how they look rather than what they do or think or create, that's still present. We've traded corsets for Spanx, morning calls for Instagram posts, Physio Amy for filters and face-tuning apps. The technology is different. The pressure is the same. So, what do we do with this knowledge? How do we move forward? First, I think we need to develop awareness. Really see the ways we're still constrained. Notice when you're uncomfortable in your clothing and ask why you're choosing to wear it. Notice how much time you spend on beauty maintenance and whether it's truly for yourself or for external approval. Notice the rules you follow without questioning them, the standards you judge yourself and other women against. Awareness is the first step toward change. Second, we need to extend grace and solidarity to other women. The Victorian women who wore corsets and bustles, who spent hours on their appearance, who followed all the rules. They weren't weak or foolish. They were navigating a system that punished nonconformity harshly. And women today who participate in beauty culture, who get cosmetic procedures, who spend time and money on their appearance, they're doing the same thing. Navigating a system that still in many ways judges women primarily on how they look. We can critique the system without judging individual women for their choices within it. Third, we should question everything. Just because something is common doesn't mean it's necessary. Just because everyone does it doesn't mean you have to. Just because something is marketed as self-care doesn't mean it's actually good for you. Victorian women were told that corsets were necessary for their health. Today, we're told that certain beauty practices are empowering. Always ask who benefits from this standard, who profits from my insecurity, what would happen if I just stopped. Fourth, we need to support alternatives. Just as the rational dress society created space for women to dress differently, we need to create space for women to opt out of oppressive beauty standards, celebrate natural aging, support comfortable, practical clothing, push back against dress codes that require uncomfortable or expensive clothing, normalize different body types, different aesthetic choices, different ways of presenting yourself to the world, and finally, remember that change is slow but possible. The Victorian women we've talked about tonight, they lived and died without seeing the full freedom that would come. But they were part of making it happen. Every small resistance matters. Every question asked, every standard challenged, every alternative chosen, it all contributes to larger change over time. Think about what Victorian women would say if they could see us now. They'd be amazed by so many things. The fact that we can vote, own property, have careers, wear comfortable clothing. But I think they'd also be disappointed by what hasn't changed, by the fact that women are still judged so heavily on appearance, by the fact that beauty culture is now a multi-billion-dollar industry, by the fact that we're still spending so much of our precious time and energy and resources on meeting standards that are arbitrary, constantly changing, and ultimately about control. We owe it to them and to ourselves to keep pushing forward, to keep questioning, to keep imagining a world where women are valued for their full humanity, not just their appearance, where comfort and practicality are prioritized over fashion, where our time is ours to spend on things that matter to us, where the rules make sense and the standards are humane. The devices that controlled Victorian women, they're in museums now. Physical artifacts from another time, the corsets, the crinolines, the curling tongs. We look at them with a mixture of fascination and horror. Someday, I hope, future generations will look back at our time the same way. They'll see our Spanx and our stilettos, our Photoshop and our cosmetic procedures, and they'll think, how did they live like that? Why did they accept those restrictions? I'm so glad we've moved beyond that. But that future won't arrive on its own. It will only come if we work toward it. If we refuse to accept the premise that our value lies in our appearance, if we teach the next generation different standards, if we support each other in making choices that prioritize health and comfort and authenticity over conformity to arbitrary ideals. The Victorian women we've met tonight, Nina with her corset, Margaret with her crinoline, Harriet burning her hair with hot tongs, Beatrice poisoning herself with arsenic, Dorothy and her 15 pounds of fabric, Florence perched on the edge of chairs because of her bustle, Margaret with her châtain, Sophia navigating etiquette Neffields, Constance spending 3 hours a day on her appearance, Ada fighting for rational dress. They're all real. They lived, they struggled, they survived within a system that constrained them at every turn. And some of them fought back in small ways and large, creating space for the freedoms we have today. We stand on their shoulders, we benefit from their resistance, and we have a responsibility to keep moving forward, to keep fighting for freedom, to keep questioning the devices and rules and standards that still constrain us. Not just for ourselves, but for the women who will come after us, so they can look back at our time and say they started to break free. They questioned the systems. They made it easier for us. That's the legacy of understanding history, not just knowing what happened, but using that knowledge to see our present more clearly and to shape a better future. The strange Victorian devices that controlled women's daily lives. They're not just relics of the past, they're warnings about the present. They remind us to stay vigilant, to keep questioning, to never accept restrictions as natural or necessary just because they're common or long-standing. And they remind us of something else too, that humans are resilient, that women in particular have endured incredible restrictions and still found ways to live, to create, to resist, to survive. Victorian women in their corsets and crinolines. They raised children, ran households, created art, wrote letters, maintained friendships, found joy despite everything. They were more than their constraints, just as we are more than ours. So as you go forward from here, as you return to your own life and your own time, I hope you'll carry some of this awareness with you. Notice the devices visible and invisible that shape your days. Question the rules that seem arbitrary or harmful. Support other women in their joy. See ease and their struggles. And remember that change is possible, even when it seems impossibly slow. Even when you face ridicule or pushback, even when you're tired. And it would be easier just to conform, because somewhere in the future, someone will look back at this moment, at the choices we're making now, at the stands we're taking or not taking, and they'll either thank us for the work we did to make their lives freer, or they'll wonder why we didn't do more, why we didn't question harder, why we didn't push back stronger, why we accepted restrictions that seem in retrospect as bizarre and arbitrary as corsets and crinolines and shelf bustles seem to us now. The choice is ours. The power is ours. The Victorian women showed us that systems can change, that resistance matters, that small acts of defiance accumulate over time into larger movements toward freedom. We just have to have the courage to keep questioning, keep resisting, keep imagining better possibilities. The night is ending. Our journey through Victorian women's daily lives is complete. We've explored the devices, the rules, the rituals, the resistance. We've seen how comprehensive the control was and how slowly liberation came. We've drawn connections to our present and imagined paths toward a freer future. Thank you for taking this journey with me. Thank you for your time, for your attention, for your willingness to sit with uncomfortable truths and difficult questions. Thank you for being here in this moment, thinking about these things. Every person who questions systems of control, who sees through the narratives we're told about what's necessary or natural or inevitable, they're part of creating change. You're part of creating change. I hope this story stays with you. I hope it makes you look at your own life a little differently. I hope it gives you permission to question, to resist, to choose free. Dom, even when that's difficult. And I hope it reminds you that you're part of a longer story. A story of women throughout history fighting for the right to breathe deeply, move freely, spend their time on things that matter and be valued for their full humanity rather than just their appearance. There are more stories to tell, more histories to explore, more connections to draw between past and present, more lessons to learn from the women who came before us. And I'll be here ready to share them with you whenever you're ready to listen. Until then, take care of yourself, question boldly, resist wisely, and remember you are more than any device, any rule, any standard could ever contain. You are full, complex, valuable human beings who deserve freedom, comfort, and the right to exist in your own bodies on your own terms. Sleep well. Dream of a world where no one is constrained by arbitrary rules. And when you wake, help make that world a reality. Thank you for being here. I'll see you in the next story.